Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth part of the Academic Agent retrospective. Today, the topic is the left, and as you can see, this is a topic I've come back to time and time again. In fact, you may argue that really the heart of this channel has been trying to understand the left, categorizing it, thinking about its psychology, its tactics, how to combat the left. And as you can see, this also goes back to the very start of the channel. The very first video I made on YouTube is included in this compilation today, right back to November 2016. I made a video called Arguments from the Left Part 1, and that went on to be a 15-part series in November and December 2016. I then went back a year later and remade the first 5 of those videos because they were a bit patchy originally in a quote-unquote deluxe version. But then, owing to a kind of lackluster response to that remake, I never went back and did parts 6 to 15 again. So as you're watching through these, you'll see that the first 5 are this deluxe version, and then you'll get the original 6 to 15. Then after that, there are videos about linguistic control and about language games. There's an intense focus on how the left manipulate language throughout these videos, how they manipulate perceptions, how they change reality with their words. As you can see, George Orwell is a constant theme as well throughout these videos. There is also an attempt to understand the psychology of the left, and also to try to describe the left as accurately as possible. Now, I have a bit of a reputation of being a bit dry, and being the guy with the PowerPoint or the chalkboard. But as you watch through these videos, I think you'll appreciate that I did experiment. Back in these early days, I was willing to, I used music. At times you'll see that some of these videos are positively avant-garde. I experimented quite a lot. You may even say I innovated, but we'll see what you make of them. Maybe you'll just find them, all these videos, cringe-worthy. But I am hoping that by the time this is finished airing, people will say, do you know what? Academic Agent Retrospective 4, Deconstructing the Left, is probably this guy's masterpiece. Anyway, just to remind you that there is a little promotion going on to tie in with this retrospective. If you use the code RETRO, that's RETRO, on the Academic Agency, you can get £100 off any of the bundles that are currently being sold. So when you factor in the discount of the bundle and take that £100 off, that's a pretty good deal. Anyway, I hope you're sitting comfortably, because there's about 4 hours of this to get through, but here's hoping that you'll learn something. In this series of videos, I'm going to try as concisely and plainly as I can to outline the intellectual foundations of the ideas that led to the modern social justice warrior. The version you see on YouTube is, of course, a slightly watered down version from half-remembered, half-understood lectures, no doubt. This is how ideas work in a culture. They originate with the intellectuals, then they filter down through politics and culture before some half-baked version of them disseminate in the mainstream. I think it's important to go back to the roots of ideas to understand them from the ground up, and then once we understand, we can start picking them apart in the process of critique. This video is going to be about liberal humanism. What is liberal humanism, and why should a social justice warrior care about it? Well, liberal humanism is the set of ideas against which practically all of the theories that social justice warriors hold so dear established themselves. This man is Clive James. He went to university in the 1960s, to Cambridge in fact, here in good old Blighty. He's one of the most well-read men in the world, and Clive James is a liberal humanist. Now, what is a humanist? A humanist is someone who believes that there is such a thing as human nature, that, regardless of culture, time or place, there are a basic set of characteristics that are distinctively human that we can recognise across history. The theorists and philosophers who form the bedrock of social justice warrior thinking reject this idea entirely. Let's go back to Clive James for a moment. I want to read a passage of his from a book called Cultural Amnesia, which I would recommend. And this is Clive James talking now. In this book can be heard the merest outside edge of an enormous conversation. As they never were in life, we can imagine the speakers all gathered in some vast room, or perhaps they are on a terrace under the stars. They are wearing name tags in case they don't recognise each other. Some of them recognise each other all too well, but they avoid eye contact. Thomas Mann, with the family poodle sniffing petulantly at his knee, would rather not talk to Bertolt Brecht, and Jean-Paul Sartre is keen to avoid Solzhenitsyn. Now this is a supreme statement of liberal humanism from Clive James, and he wears it proudly on his sleeve in the book that follows. Liberal humanism imagined that, because human nature is fundamentally unchanging, all of the great men and women in history were engaged in such an enormous conversation. The vicissitudes of history can come and go like so many catwalk fashions, but the great minds of the past, united by their common humanity and by the great enduring themes of love, war, hope and struggle, can engage each other across the artificial boundaries of nationality and time. It was a nice idea. In many ways it still is, but you can see how the social justice warriors might start attacking it. I'm not going to lay that out for you. Just either, if you are a social justice warrior, start doing it yourselves, and if you're not, just imagine how they might attack this idea. I'm not going to go any further in this video. I just want to point out that before all other questions lies this fundamental question: is there such a thing as a human nature? Do you believe that there is? If so, you are a humanist. And if not, you are an anti-humanist who believes some version of what we might call social constructivism. You see human beings primarily as the product of their time and place, with few, if any, useful instincts. Now, as I've said, all of the theorists who underlie modern identity politics, the modern day social justice warrior, are anti-humanists. And in the next few videos I'm going to go through a number of these anti-humanist ideas. I will leave it for you to draw the line, the arrow that is, between those and the modern day social justice warrior. Watch this space. In this video I'm going to talk about ideology. Before social justice warriors talked about the patriarchy, they talked about ideology. What is ideology? This is an idea that comes out of Marxist thinking. If you remember, Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, predicted that the proletariat, that is, the working class, men and women, would eventually rise up and overthrow their capitalist oppressors. He predicted this would happen not in agricultural countries like Russia or China, but in rich, industrialised nations like France, Germany, and yes, good old Blighty too. But it didn't happen, and as the decades wore on into the 1960s, it continued not to happen. Why?
So much was said on both sides. I'm confused. How can you know what to believe when there's so much propaganda?
Why didn't it happen?
Growing up the son of a huge plantation owner in Mississippi puts a white man in contact with a whole lot of black faces. I spent my whole life here, right here in Candy Land, surrounded by black faces. I seeing them every day, day in, day out. I only had one question. Why don't they kill us?
No chance, so that's what you got. Up against a machine too strong. Pretty politicians buying souls for run song puppets. Won't find their place in line. But tie a string around your finger now, boy, 'cause it's just a matter of time. 'Cause you've got no chance. No chance at all. You've got no chance. No chance at all. You've got no chance. No chance at all. You've got no chance. No chance at all.
Well, one Marxist thinker, Louis Althusser, had the answer. It was because of ideology. Now, this is in fact a pretty simple idea. The workers didn't rise up because capitalism essentially tricked them into thinking that they were serving their own interests rather than being exploited. It gave them a sense of hope and identity, things like the American dream, and if you want to put it forward, X Factor and other such nonsense. But Althusser added a twist. This wasn't a case of the ruling classes tricking the masses. It wasn't just the working classes who were caught up in ideology. It was everyone. That's right, everyone. Even the masters, even the intellectuals, the middle managers, schools, teachers, parents. Everyone was caught up, in Althusser's phrase, interpolated by ideology. In fact, Althusser went further. He said that people in society don't do as they're told through coercion, they work best, in his words, by themselves. That is, individuals mostly get themselves up to go to work on time, they hand themselves in if they get into trouble, they clock in and clock out of work, they regulate their own behaviour. The state doesn't really need to intervene that much because when it's business as usual, the general populace is content to carry on in the belief that this entire way of life is absolutely natural and normal. Never once do they stop to question what they're doing. And this situation is ideology. Ideology makes people think that their learnt, socially programmed beliefs are in fact the natural order, so much so that they are common sense. And this idea has been tremendously influential for thinkers on the left because it gave them a powerful tool with which to critique the status quo. And can you see how this idea is still at the very foundations of modern social justice warrior thinking? I hope that you can. For example, let's take the distrust of common sense. Common sense had been a powerful tool for plain speaking, ordinary language philosophers such as Bertrand Russell only a few years earlier, but now it was to be utterly distrusted. Just like Neo in the Matrix waking up in that vat, nothing you know to be real is actually real, because you are in the matrix of ideology. Everything you are, everything you know, everyone you know, every life choice you made are a consequence of ideology. So when battling a social justice warrior, it is crucial to understand that this idea about ideology is buried deep in their entire worldview, whether they know it or not. And again, I'm not going to spend any time pulling apart these ideas in these videos because I want you to think about them and to come to your own conclusions about these ideas. Anti-SJWs know your enemy and social justice warriors know yourselves. It's important that you do so if we are to have any hope of ever having a sensible discussion about any of these things. In the last part of this series, I talked about ideology. Remember, it's something that contains everyone. But even for those on the left, Louis Althusser's ideas were a little too top-down and centred on the state. Here was a Marxist idea that, ironically, made the systems of power, that is, the machinations of ideology, so perfect that the communist revolution was made to seem impossible. In fact, not just revolutionary change, but any change at all. If everyone was caught in ideology, how could anyone ever speak out against it? Where could the resistance to the status quo actually come from? And if you've seen the first part of this series, you'll remember that since everyone on the left also had to adhere now to anti-humanism, that is, the rejection of human nature and the idea that human beings are almost entirely the products of their culture with very few useful instincts, the resistance couldn't just come from people and their own ideas, since everything that they know and think is socially determined. And so the intellectual left, supposedly the force of radical change, was in a bit of a bind. For this reason, Althusser's rather monolithic concept of ideology had to be modulated into cultures, and the top-down, state-centric idea of power also had to be nuanced. For this, leftists in the 1970s, such as Raymond Williams, looked back to an Italian Marxist from the 1930s called Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci had been imprisoned by fascists under Mussolini, and while in prison wrote his most famous ideas in a book called Prison Notebooks, a kind of 30s Marxist update of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. The most important idea taken from Gramsci was that of hegemony. Gramsci argued that at any given time there will be a ruling class, a group of people who achieve hegemony over all of the other groups of people. But that power struggle wasn't simple or straightforward. It took the form of a perpetual struggle, which keeps the ruling class in a constant state of check. If the hegemonic group overstepped its boundaries, then all of these struggles between all of the other groups would boil over, and a new group would emerge to take the place of the old one as the new hegemony. Raymond Williams updated this idea by adding some snazzy labels to the different groups. At any one time, society has a dominant culture, for example, capitalism, and then residual cultures, that is, cultures from a bygone era that still affect the present, for example, the Catholic Church. And then there are emergent cultures, that is, those cultures that are seeking ultimately to supplant the dominant one, for example, socialism. Inspired by Raymond Williams, a whole generation of leftist intellectuals in the 1980s and 1990s developed an idea that the chief form of political change would thus come through dissident subcultures. What is a subculture? Well, it is any culture that is not part of hegemony. So you can have a black subculture, a gay subculture, a female subculture, and so on and so forth. Since individuals, on their own, being entirely the product of their cultures, had little chance of changing the status quo on their own, they had a much better chance if they banded together in these dissident collectives. If you form a dissident subculture, you can start socially conditioning people in a different way, not towards the culture of hegemony, but towards the concerns of the subculture, your own group instead. And I hope you can see by this point how these ideas give birth to modern identity politics. The YouTube social justice warriors are not typically quoting Gramsci or Raymond Williams, but can you see how the logic of these ideas absolutely underpin everything for which they stand? Now, as ever, I'm not going to critique these ideas or read them for you. It's up to you to reach your own conclusions. Maybe you're broadly convinced of these ideas, and if so, great, tell me. But if you're not, think about why. One aspect of social justice warrior thinking that often frustrates their intellectual rivals is their total distrust of science. When presented with apparent facts, their move is almost always to relativize or question the claims made by those facts. What led to this extraordinary state of affairs? Well, first, I think it is important to go back to the intellectual climate after the Second World War. Since the great age of the Enlightenment, liberal humanist voices had been telling us that a great education in the arts and sciences would make us morally better people. But the Nazis read Shakespeare and listened to Wagner, and yet they were still murderous bastards. So there goes that idea of the arts. But what about the sciences? Well, again, the Nazis and other far-right types had been using eugenics and other such arguments to justify their racism. White people were thought to be superior to black people on biological grounds. There were also biological arguments for sexism and homophobia. So there goes science too. Well, not quite, but intellectuals on the left now had a reason to distrust the ways in which science could be used. One crucial figure in this respect is Michel Foucault, whose penetrating deconstruction of psychiatry and mental asylums showed how the codification of what does and doesn't count as madness changed over the years. Think of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and you are halfway there. Another crucial figure here is Jean-Francois Lyotard. He argued that throughout human history we had always had grand meta-narratives, that is, one big story that explains all the other stories. A very good example of this is the Bible. I have mentioned other grand meta-narratives already, for example, the idea of the Enlightenment. For Lyotard, in the 20th century, the old grand meta-narratives had come to be replaced by a new one, science. But he argued, just as there was just cause to be sceptical of religion and 18th century intellectuals, there was also just cause to be sceptical of science. Lyotard argued that all grand meta-narratives are bad and that we should aim to smash them apart. And to this smashing of grand meta-narratives, he gave the name post-modernity. And I think it is fair to say that some residue of the profound distrust of science found in the work of Foucault and Lyotard endures in the modern-day intellectual left and its social justice warrior variants. As ever, I'm going to apply the suspension of judgment here. I want you to come to your own conclusions about the historical misuses of science, grand meta-narratives, and whether any of those things mean that we should constantly be distrustful of science. Just as leftist thinkers had deconstructed and therefore distrusted science, following thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger, ironically one of them inspired Nazism and the other one actually was a Nazi, they also came to deconstruct and relativize morality. What is good and what is evil? These are fundamental questions of ethics that have been central to philosophy since Socrates, Aristotle and Plato. In the Western Christian tradition, arguably it was Aristotle's vision of morality that was most widely taught, that is, virtue ethics. Virtue ethics lies at the heart of Christian notions such as sins and vices. What was important for thinkers in that tradition was your moral character. Are you cowardly? Are you wise? Are you patient? Are you hard-working? Are you proud? Are you ambitious? Are you honest? These notions are still, broadly speaking, at the heart of our moral thinking, at least in the lay, everyday world. Except, of course, they aren't, because over time, different and competing moral systems came to the fore. Immanuel Kant, for example, that old pissant as Monty Python might say, had a different way of thinking about it, as did Hegel, as did Machiavelli, and so on and so forth. Surely all of these different systems can't be right, can they? Well, Isaiah Berlin had some interesting efforts at trying to reconcile widely competing moral systems, and he called this value pluralism. This is the idea that there can be two rights or two wrongs. It is the logic of choosing the lesser of two evils or the greater of two goods. It's actually more sensible than it sounds. Anyway, in the second half of the 20th century, the left, broadly speaking, retreated from asking such moral questions. Morality was old hat. It had been debunked by people like Nietzsche and shown to be relative. 60s counterculture was all about defining one's own morals.
Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine.
What was right and what was wrong became a kind of consumer choice matter. You might like Mars bars, I like Reese's peanut butter cups. You might think freedom is really important, but me, I like law and social order. Oh no, those two things are different. That must mean that morality is relative. But what can we do? I mean, we don't agree. Your morality runs counter to mine, but we still have to respect each other's point of view, don't we? Well, this is a pickle, isn't it? I know, let's just say that we are both kind of right and kind of wrong and agree to just accept and tolerate each other. And also, let's not talk about it, okay? Good. And this is essentially what the left did time and time and time again. Even after the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other extremely intolerant groups, they resolved in moral relativism. Now, as ever, I am not judging. I am asking you to come up with your response to that. Are you a moral relativist? Why? How? And if not, why not? You tell me. I'd like to thank Son of Tiamat, Cult of the Lich, Tyson Powell, Ginger Bill, Charles Vinson, Edward Dara, Blake Barrows, and Nathan Pullum. One of the principles that has become a real orthodoxy in leftist thinking is the idea that gender and sexuality are social constructions. Where I work at the university, I hear some version of this idea on an almost daily basis. The book I hold chiefly responsible for this is called Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. Now, I'm going to say something that some feminists might find controversial. Everything about this book is entirely predictable to the point of inevitability. In my view, it's just a logical extension of the ideas that I've already talked about in previous parts of this series. Let's do a little review of some of those assumptions that I've already outlined, and then it should become clear why Judith Butler's idea about gender being performative and socially conditioned are essentially just a footnote to them, which says, and this is true of gender at just about every turn. So, if you recall, in part 1 I outlined how leftist thinkers rejected liberal humanism and insisted that human beings have few, if any, useful instincts and are almost entirely the products of their time and place. In part 2, I outlined how Marxists argue that everyone is socially conditioned by ideology, and this is why people don't rise up and overthrow capitalism. In part 3, I outlined how other Marxists argue that the key way of attacking the status quo is to form dissident subcultures. In part 4, I argued how other thinkers on the left, such as Michel Foucault and Jean-Francois Lyotard, told us that science is to be distrusted and that grand meta-narratives are bad and should be torn apart. And finally, in part 5, I showed how traditional moral values have been destabilized and relativized to the point where the idea of an accepted set of behaviors that everyone finds right or wrong, or desirable or undesirable, was seen and is still seen as an anachronism. Like most thinkers on the left, Judith Butler did not really stop to question any of these assumptions. She accepted them as advances, as progress in the social struggle. But for her, there was a dimension missing, and that dimension was gender. The Marxists had a habit of writing in quite an abstract way. They wouldn't talk about men and women, but individuals and classes and groups. So Butler's only real point was to say that all of this stuff about ideology and culture socially conditioning individuals, their beliefs and their behaviours, well, that's true of their gender roles as well. And this leads her to the staggering breakthrough that gender is performative. Now, what does she mean by this? Well, you see, because human beings were born with virtually no instincts, and because everything they are is a product of ideology and culture, it stands to reason that what we consider to be typical masculine behaviours and typical feminine behaviours are a social construction. For example, if you give a little boy a toy gun and sit him in front of He-Man and WWF wrestling, he might grow up thinking that resolving conflict through violence is to be lauded. You are conditioning him to be more aggressive and to replicate these supposedly masculine behaviours. By the same token, if you take a little girl and give her a Barbie doll to play with, you are latently preparing her for more stereotypically feminine roles that involve nurturing, for example, being a mother or being a nurse. Butler's argument is that we cannot hope to topple the patriarchy until we find a way of challenging and overturning these social constructions. Why should little girls have pink and boys have blue? Why should girls be made to play with Barbies and boys with guns and action figures? Why should women have long hair and boys have short hair? For Butler, all of this stuff is total bullshit, and her call is for feminists everywhere to combat this sick and wrong indoctrination of the youngsters. And that is it, basically. It's not particularly a deep idea, although by this point there are hundreds of books dedicated to pointing out all of the ways in which gender has been constructed over history. Now, I've sometimes wondered why they haven't wondered why it is that so many of the gender tropes that reoccur across history and cultures are fundamentally the same. But naturally, they'll point me to the one example in 10,000 of some random tribe somewhere which set up the gender roles in a slightly different way. More on that in a later video, because this is another defining feature of leftist thinking. Now, it's rather difficult for me to suspend judgment on this one, because I happen to believe that these ideas are not only a load of old rubbish, but actually pernicious. I believe Judith Butler and many other feminists who have followed her actually serve to hinder the feminist cause by their basic inability to call a spade a spade. But I will withhold, at least for now, my reasons for thinking this. If you disagree with me, I'd love to hear the arguments for why you do, and if you agree with me, likewise, I would like to hear more arguments for why I am right. Till next time. Now, this is going to be one of the shortest videos in this series because, just as Judith Butler's advances in theory were barely a step from the Marxist social constructivist thinkers that had gone before her, so too were the so-called queer theories barely a step beyond her. It simply boils down to this. All the stuff that Judith Butler said about gender being performative and socially conditioned, well, that's true of sexuality too. And that's literally it. In fact, once you understand the basic idea from Louis Althusser that everyone is interpolated and conditioned by ideology, you start to see how the next 50 years of scholarship on the left is dedicated simply to pointing out this fact over and over and over again in different areas of life. I honestly have nothing else to say about this one. I did once ask one of the most prominent queer theorists ever to have lived whether he thought that he had been socially conditioned to be gay, but honestly, I just don't understand how any gay person can possibly hold this view. Then again, I'm not gay. Incidentally, the answer I got back from him was something to do with identifying wrongly to the cultural and ideological stimulus. That is, not in the way that you are supposed to, but in a queer way, hence queer theory. So yes, they do actually believe that being gay or being straight is something to do with social rather than biological stimulus. Well, anyway, I'll keep it short and sweet. Let me know what you think. See you next time. One underlying assumption that has been latent but not made explicit in all of the ideas I've been talking about so far in this series is the idea that capitalism is bad. Now, this should come as no surprise when you consider that the vast majority of the thinkers I've been talking about were either fully paid-up card-carrying Marxists or else part of a socialist tradition of thinking far to the left of anything that you'd find in mainstream politics, well, at least until Jeremy Corbyn showed up. Like many ideas on the left, this one is just something that is seldom, if ever, questioned. It's just taken as read. It's common knowledge. It's a de facto assumption. I guess some notion of Karl Marx's analysis of capitalism lies behind it. Capitalism is bad because it leads to gross inequality, relies on exploitation, and alienates workers. Something like that will do. And this is the forever deferred ultimate end goal of all of these other ideas. Once you have deconstructed and destabilized all of the grand meta-narratives, once you have broken ideology and the patriarchy with dissident subcultures, and once you have broken the artificial binaries of socially constructed gender, what then? Well, what then? Well, hopefully by then the whole evil system of capitalism will come tumbling down. Now, somewhat unusual for someone in my profession, I happen to think that capitalism is a jolly good idea. Why? Well, simply because the basic economics of supply and demand work, almost like magic, in such a way that can get me a tin of sweet corn at a price point of 70 pence. The system of calculations and chain of causal relations that go into that price point are so vast that it couldn't really be planned out. It just kinda happens. Planned economies in general have a much harder time of reaching nice affordable price points like this, and the ones that we have seen in history have led either to horrible famines or else people punching each other in supermarkets to buy the last available potato in all of Russia. And that's why I believe capitalism, despite its many flaws, is still broadly a good system. So next time you are in Starbucks quaffing lattes with your socialist or Marxist friend, ask them about how much they are prepared to pay for a tin of sweet corn, or indeed for an overpriced coffee, and take it from there. And yes, I know sweet corn probably costs a lot less than 70 pence, but hell, I'm in my ivory tower, I'm out of touch, shoot me. When you are arguing with someone from the left, you might make a statement about what is generally true, and they will then fall over themselves trying to find an example that contradicts your rule. And this one example that doesn't fit your rule is then taken as the definitive proof that your rule must be wrong. You see, the leftists cannot entertain the notion that something might generally be the case with certain exceptions. No. Their will is to point to exceptional cases and use it as the definitive proof that there is no general case. To my way of thinking, this is very annoying. It is an assumption that lies at the bedrock of many leftist ideas, especially those advanced by the modern-day social justice warrior. Let us take the example of the transgender person. Apparently only 0.6% of people are transgender. By my calculations, that's less than 1 in 100. Most people don't really question or care to question their gender. I'm male because I was born with a penis, you're female because you were born with a vagina, no problem. But the existence of this 0.6% is taken by many people as being enough to disprove our simple and happy binary. And because society must be fair to everyone and not just 99.4% of people, social justice warriors set their stall on trying to change all of the rules to accommodate the 0.6%. Now, I happen to believe that exceptions tend to prove the rule rather than disprove it. If something is generally the case, I tend to think of exceptions as being statistical outliers for which there are probably good causes. But for most leftists, this way of thinking discriminates against the minority in ways that aren't fair, because for them, one exception is enough to disprove the rule. One curious feature of social justice warriorism in all its forms is its insatiable desire to condemn the past for its perceived transgressions against its values. Let's take the example of Cecil Rhodes, a man who built, as the bankers in Mary Poppins might say,
railways through Africa.
He also established the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship, a country called Rhodesia, which is now called Zimbabwe, you know, the country ruled over by one of the most brutal dictators ever to have lived, that one, and Rhodes University in South Africa. Among other things, Cecil Rhodes used his understanding of supply and demand economics artificially to starve the diamond market in order to ensure that demand would always outstrip supply, thereby making diamonds seem very desirable and thereby pushing the price of diamonds sky high, where they've remained ever since. But you see, Cecil Rhodes was a racist, and racism is bad.
Okay.
And Cecil Rhodes was an imperialist, and of course, imperialism is bad.
Okay.
An imperialist, and of course, imperialism is bad. Therefore, we must conclude that Cecil Rhodes was bad. I mention Rhodes because at my old college at the venerable Oxford University, there was an almighty hoo-ha recently in which various social justice warriors protested that the statue of Cecil Rhodes, a man who gave millions of pounds to the college and set up, as I mentioned, one of the most prestigious scholarships in the world, must be removed. And their argument is that he must be removed because Cecil Rhodes was a racist, and racism is bad. We must condemn racism. The past was racist, therefore we must condemn the past.
Okay.
Another of the assumptions that is seldom, if ever, questioned by leftist academics is the idea that stability is bad. Nothing titillates a leftist into a frisson more than the idea of destabilizing or deconstructing or complicating a notion that was formerly thought to be stable. In fact, while poor old Sargon of Akkad and people like Morley Gray fumble about looking for a clear definition of the patriarchy, they must know that they will never find one because the people who made it up delight in its very instability. They love it. They champion the unstable. In this video, I want to try to account for where this fetish for destabilization came from. Before that, though, I want to pause briefly to consider a thinker who believed that same stable notion of knowledge could be found: Bertrand Russell. Russell was an empiricist, and his view of truth ultimately boils down to something that looks like common sense. For Russell, the chair I'm sitting on exists, and I have knowledge of it because of the various ways in which I've become acquainted with that chair, and of course because of my prior knowledge of chairs as described to me by others. So I have no real reason to doubt that yes, this is a real chair, that is, it exists, and yes, indeed, it is a chair. I'd like to play a little clip of Russell, not only because this down-to-earth attitude warms the cockles of one's heart, but also because posh men with pipes are quite fun to watch.
One last question. Suppose, Lord Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time. What would you think it's worth telling that generation about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it?
I should like to say two things. One intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you would wish to believe or by what you think would have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. And if we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet.
Bertrand Russell's nice cosy world of words with common sense, stable meanings there. But that nice cosy world was about to be ripped apart in the 1970s by, yes, another French theorist, Jacques Derrida. Derrida was particularly taken with the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who countered the traditional focus on etymology in linguistics, that is, looking at the history of how words acquire their meanings, by focusing instead on how language actually functions in the here and now. Now, we don't need to go into this too much, but there are two key ideas Derrida takes from Saussure. One is that when I say chair and you picture a chair, the relationship between the sound chair and the actual physical chair and the one that you are picturing in your head is completely arbitrary. There is nothing about the sound chair or those letters on the page that has anything to do with the actual chair. So how then do we understand the sound and the letters as meaning chair? And this is the second key idea. We understand it to mean chair because it is not dog, cat, fridge freezer, lemon, or any other word. We understand it because it is different. And the best way this was ever explained to me was by an old lecturer of mine who said, how do we understand tall people to be tall? Short people. How do we understand fat people to be fat? Thin people, and the only way things acquire their meaning is through that difference. Now Derrida takes this idea and comes up with his own concept of différance, which is like difference only with a French accent. Basically, all of the words in the entire language are in this near infinite chain of difference, and this infinite chain is known as difference. Now, to cut a long story short, all this means is that ultimately meaning breaks down. When I say chair, which chair do you picture? Is it this one? No? Well, anyway, this was the one that I had in mind, and I could try to add more descriptors to it. It's a red chair, it's an old chair, it's a wooden chair, and so on. But no matter how many adjectives I add, the meaning ends up being deferred endlessly, because the sign and the referent have become unhinged. Anyway, that's the theory, but in practice this has led people on the left in universities all over the world thinking that stability inherently is bad and that instability should be celebrated. And so they set about destabilizing any and all concepts they could get their hands on, including, as we've seen, gender and sexuality and other seemingly stable categories. The will to destabilize is insatiable. They love a bit of instability. And so I have to ask, regardless of whether or not language is a perfect system of communicating ideas precisely, is stability really bad? Why? Can't we just apply some common sense like good old Bertrand Russell sometimes? Why not? You tell me. Another widely held belief, not just on the left but among practically everyone in the West, is that homogeneity is bad, and on the flip side that heterogeneity and diversity are good. Why should this be the case? Well, I assume that the celebration of diversity is chiefly a response to the atrocities of the 20th century, namely totalitarian regimes that seem to stamp homogeneity everywhere. But, as with many things, has it gone too far? In this video, I want to interrogate the idea that diversity and heterogeneity are necessarily good things, because you see, diversity and heterogeneity are built on the concept of difference, whereas homogeneity is built on the concept of sameness. I have this idea that for a culture to achieve social cohesion, there must be some degree of shared values in that culture, and, just speaking very fundamentally, shared values rely on sameness, not on difference. Now, for all of the problems that there are with organised religion, in history churches have undeniably helped to bind communities together by giving them a set of common shared values. Forget about God for a second, I'm talking about plain old values. Peace, love, unity, joy, patience, charity, forgiveness. The belief in these sorts of things binds people together. It literally should not matter if you are an atheist or a feminist or a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or any other type of person. We can surely agree that these things are mostly desirable qualities. Of course, some leftist thinkers somewhere will want to come along to destabilise and relativize these categories, but why would you even want to do that when these values bring people together? Let us consider Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
I still have a dream.
Look at the appeals that he makes in this speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
He's emphasizing sameness, not difference.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
He's emphasizing once again sameness, not difference.
I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice.
Once again, he's emphasizing sameness, not difference.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
He's emphasizing sameness, not difference. And the last part there, not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character, is a really, really overlooked facet of his message. Overlooked routinely these days by social justice warriors who actually do seem to want to use the colour of someone's skin as a kind of positive affirmation. This wasn't King's message. He wanted equality and unity. He wanted togetherness. He wanted, in a sense, a type of shared homogeneity among people. In the late 20th century, the chief binding agent in society was no longer the church, because most people didn't go. It was replaced by things like television, but even this, there was a kind of togetherness in the fact that millions of people were all watching the same things at the same time. People could go to work and congregate around the proverbial water cooler about what they'd seen last night. There was a genuine cachet. Here in good old Blighty, growing up with only 4 television channels, one would pick up an awful lot of things just by osmosis. Waiting for my favourite show to come on, maybe I'd sit through something I'd never usually have watched, and that's something else that I share with whoever else was watching at the time. This included, of course, reruns, and so I came to know all sorts of programmes that, strictly speaking, were before my time.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run?
And we all had the experience of sitting down on a rainy night and just happening upon a film. And through this, over the years, one builds up quite a vast reservoir of what I'd call cultural cachet. Now, with the rise of the internet, even this final bastion of some sense of togetherness has been all but entirely eviscerated by an on-demand culture. So now people not only do not share the same values, they don't even have knowledge of the same television programmes and films, because why would a random 18-year-old go out of their way to watch anything old? That takes a lot of effort. There's a huge difference between actively seeking something out and just happening to catch it sitting there. And think about all the other incidental stuff you miss out on as well. The news, which increasingly comes fed through, post-factual lenses of social media. Not just knowledge of world figures and world events. And again, this, I think, underlines and exacerbates other cultural divisions. If you don't have any shared common reference points, it's harder to feel like you are part of the same society. But despite these things, our culture has consistently pushed the message that difference is good, that diversity should be celebrated, and that homogeneity is bad. So I would like people who watch this to comment on whether they do think that homogeneity is as bad as it's made out to be. Why? Is having a common set of values really such a bad thing? And I ask this question at a time when society seems more divided than it has ever been before. Hello, I'd like to introduce you to somebody. This is Tim, also known as Demotivator Opinion. Tim is a nice young man whose heart is very much in the right place. He wants to do the right thing. Broadly speaking, he, like me, would like the world to be a better place. However, it appears that faced with the same facts and the same world, we disagree on how exactly to go about doing this. Now, in a recent video, Tim had this to say.
So, I honestly often say, I don't know what you're talking about, what do you mean, what are you saying? What the fuck are you on about? Because people's arguments don't make a lot of sense, and I've thought about this a lot, and the reason that a lot of the arguments don't make sense to me is because I have different values and I inhabit a different worldview than you do. Now, I know some people will characterize that as, oh yes, you live in your beautiful little snowflake palace, I live in reality. But I think a lot of the time, what you see as reality, I see just as a lack of interpreting things. Like, for example, if you've got black crime statistics, you can just say, look at the black crime. And just quickly on the values point, I think a lot of anti-SJWs and anti-feminists and MRAs, whatever, whomever, on the internet that I often get in arguments with, they often take their worldview as established and normal and like the status quo. So when they collide with someone who has different values, such as myself, it instantly gets confused because they're like, why don't you just agree with me? Why don't we have the same point of view? This doesn't make sense.
In this video, I want to try to account for disagreements that are really frustrating him. I want to explain why it is that generally good people disagree over so much. And to do this, I'm going to draw pretty extensively on a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which I have found personally to be completely transformative of how I understand the world. Haidt and many other psychologists and social scientists have developed a way of thinking about moral decision-making called moral foundations theory. They argue that throughout human history, all human morality can be boiled down as responding to these 6 broad foundations. According to Haidt and others, these 6 foundations are innate in human moral thinking, and therefore universal. This is not to say that everyone responds equally to all 6 foundations, but rather that we each have the capacity to respond to them. Haidt makes an analogy to taste receptors on the tongue. We all have the capacity to taste sweet, salty or sour foods, but that does not mean that we all must necessarily like the taste of those foods. Gary Marcus makes another analogy, that the brain is like a book which at birth already has a rough draft written in outline. Even though no chapters are complete, nature provides the first draft, which experience then revises. Built in does not mean unmalleable, it means organized in advance of experience. Culture can mediate, mould and shape our natural tendencies, but there is a limit to the extent to which this is possible. And this is Jonathan Haidt speaking. One of the death blows to behaviorism was the demonstration that animals have constraints of learning. Some pairings of stimuli and responses are so heavily prepared that the animal can learn them on a single training trial, while other associations go against the animal's nature and cannot be learned in thousands of trials. Virtue theories would thus be improved if they took account of the kinds of virtues that fit the human mind and of the kinds that do not. Virtues are indeed cultural achievements. They are cultural achievements built and partly constrained by deeply rooted preparedness to construe and respond to the social world in particular ways. And incidentally, this echoes a passage in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that I will not go into here. So, virtues can be socially constructed and learned, but they must still work by activating these innate moral modules or taste receptors. We cannot go against our natures, and our sense of virtue in some sense derives from this. Historically, in moral philosophy, this position has been called natural law. When it comes to morality, the area in which human nature has been most keenly felt in recent scientific studies is in areas of altruism. This is the subject of Richard Dawkins's The Selfish Gene, which argues that animals, including humans, are capable of selflessness in the service of their selfish genes. That is to say, they are able to be selfless in order to ensure the survival of a particular set of genes. Dawkins does not see scope for altruism outside of this, except in cases of quid pro quo arrangements of mutual benefit, also known as reciprocal altruism. Following Charles Darwin's idea of group selection, Haidt argues, contra Dawkins, that while humans are naturally selfish, they are also naturally groupish. He says, I mean that our minds contain a variety of mental mechanisms that make us adapt at promoting our group's interest in competition with other groups. We are not saints, but we are sometimes good team players. According to Haidt, individuals can temporarily look beyond their own self-interests in a sort of momentary transcendence to become part of an organism larger than itself. This effect is somewhat tribal in nature and cannot extend to all of humanity. That is to say, its effectiveness and possibilities for existence necessarily depend on competition between different groups. There is no small degree of disagreement over this among evolutionists. The important thing for us here is that no matter its exact constitution, they are agreed that there is an underlying human nature that is mostly selfish, which both constrains and shapes moral decision-making. In addition, Haidt and other advocates of moral foundations theory argue that moral thinking is primarily intuitive and gut instinctual rather than deliberative. The intuition comes first and strategic reasoning follows. Ethical reasoning is most often post hoc, that is, a justification for a snap judgment made in the spur of the moment. His favourite metaphor is that of the elephant, intuition, and the rider, strategic reasoning. When human beings evolved the capacity for language and reasoning at some point in the last million years, the brain did not rewire itself to hand over the reins to a new and inexperienced charioteer. Rather, the rider, that is language-based reasoning, evolved because it did something useful for the elephant. The rider is skilled at fabricating post hoc explanations for what the elephant has just done, and it is good at finding reasons for whatever the elephant wants to do next. Reason is the servant of the intuitions. The rider was put there in the first place to serve the elephant. Now, it is clear that the elephant is the one in control, with the rider acting more like a little defense lawyer. The rider seldom questions the elephant because of the heuristic of confirmation bias. We make our judgments rapidly, and we are dreadful at seeking out evidence that might disconfirm those initial judgments. Now, I want to go back to those 6 foundations and think about some of our current arguments between so-called social justice warriors and their opponents. I see social justice warriors as primarily and almost exclusively focusing on questions of care and harm. This is why their focus seems to gravitate towards issues such as victims of sexual abuse. They are responding really in quite a natural way to prevent harm and to protect victims. And this is what is going on also when we see the so-called act of white knighting, for which some social justice warriors are notorious. Their appeals are almost always for compassion. And you will all know the phrase bleeding heart liberals. But you see, not everyone responds to the moral foundation of care and harm with equal strength. Some people, and this would be most of those on the so-called anti-social justice warrior side of the argument, respond much more strongly to the foundation of liberty and oppression. Where social justice warriors see themselves preventing harm, anti-social justice warriors see them shutting down debate and free speech and generally being oppressive. Now, Haidt argues that when it comes to this, the left find themselves at a natural disadvantage to the right because the right recognises all 6 of these foundations, whereas the left has a really narrow focus on just care and harm, and in some cases on liberty and oppression. So in political elections, the left has an automatic disadvantage because it is pushing on just 1 or 2 levers, whereas the right pushes on all 6. And this, I think, partly accounts for the fact that anti-social justice warrior YouTube accounts have many more subscribers than social justice warrior ones. We are talking hundreds of thousands of subscribers versus, well, rather more less than that. And this natural disadvantage is one of the reasons why I keep advocating that the left in general needs to have a bit of a rethink about its assumptions, but most importantly, a rethink about how it puts across its message. If you put across your message in a way that turns people off on a wide scale, not only are you ultimately going to lose the argument, but you're also going to lose elections and the power to actually change things in the real world. So if you've been watching this and following my argument closely, I'd recommend that you go over to moralfoundationstheory.org and do the little questionnaire that they have there and see what sort of moral compass comes back. And then, looking at that moral compass, think about the sorts of positions that you have advanced and defended in the past. And then have a think about somebody with a different moral compass and how you might go about persuading them, knowing what you do about these different moral foundations now, of your point of view. In this video, I'm going to talk about the idea that reason is a patriarchal construct. Designed in such a way to silence women and minority groups. Now, I must point out that even within social justice warrior circles, this position is not universally held, but it is one that has some purchase. The idea goes something like this. Science and logic are male discourses, and since most scientists are male, we can't trust their evidence in any case. The entire framework of thinking we can derive at a more accurate version of the truth through empirical research is known broadly as positivism, and some feminists have argued that positivism, rather than finding any real objective truth, is actually just another form of white male mystification. That is, it is used to cloak the mechanisms of white patriarchal power that is keeping everybody else down. There are several studies that push this argument. For example, Laura Parsons' PhD thesis, Are STEM Syllabi Gendered? A Feminist Critical Discourse Analysis, or Andrea Nye's Words of Power, a feminist reading of the history of logic. I'm going to focus instead, though, on just one article that I found by Sian Ferguson, in which he writes, 4 reasons demanding objectivity in social justice debates can be oppressive. I shall link this in the notes. She says, having your perspective dismissed because it isn't objective enough is an incredibly frustrating and unfortunately common experience. But a lot of us, both in social justice circles and out, tend to glorify objectivity in debates. Often we think arguments and discussions are better when they're unemotional, unbiased, and unattached from personal perspectives, exactly as we were taught by oppressive systems. Okay, well, let's see where this goes. In her book, Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins gives a brilliant explanation of how positivism, a school of thought that values objectivity and provable arguments, benefits white men the most. She also points out that black feminists and womanists have developed an alternative form of epistemology or way of understanding knowledge that she refers to as black feminist thought. At risk of oversimplification, black feminist thought centers the lived experiences of marginalized people. It argues that subjectivity is valuable because people's lived experiences are valuable, because people's spoken truths are in and of themselves truths. And it argues against the idea that objectivity, which involves an emotional detachment from knowledge, is important in all academic fields, and this is an important perspective, particularly when exploring social justice. Okay, so what I'm getting so far is that potentially the facts of a given matter, derived from empirical methods, could be harmful because they don't take people's feelings into account. Subjective experience is actually more important than trying to establish an accurate picture of the truth. Now, I'm not going to say anything. I want you to think about these ideas yourself. So she continues, so with the work of Patricia Hill Collins and others in mind, let's take a look at some of the reasons why glorifying objectivity in social justice debates can not only be counterproductive, but really oppressive. Reason number 1 then. Often those who seem objective are actually just privileged. I'm white, so I've never experienced racial oppression. Racism is all around me, but I can feel a bit distant from the issue because I've never personally been hurt by it. As such, it's relatively easy for me to stay calm and unaffected in discussions on racism. When I see racist remarks, I don't feel personally attacked, so I don't express anger or feel like crying, so I'm able to talk about it in a way that seems calm and cool. To many people then, I might seem like I'm being fairly objective during these debates. Here's the thing though, my distance isn't a sign of being more rational. It doesn't mean my arguments are more logical, and it doesn't mean I'm objective. Being able to remain unaffected during discussions about racism is a result of my white privilege. I'm not at all an expert on racial oppression, but because people view objectivity as a requirement for a solid argument, my perspectives on racism might seem sound and logical. People of colour, on the other hand, experience racism regularly, and it can be incredibly difficult for them to seem calm during debates about something that affects them so often and so intimately. In this context, my seemingly objective arguments might be given more weight than the arguments of people of colour, those who are directly affected by racism and therefore actually understand what it's like to experience racism. And that's ridiculous, right? And then she goes on to use some other examples of other oppressed minority groups. I will be returning to some of these talking points in another video called Check Your Privilege, but for now I'm not going to comment. Let's see what reason number 2 is. So number 2, Everyone speaks from a social position and has biases. When it comes to conversations about social justice and oppression, objectivity is a myth. None of us is unbiased. Not even the most level-headed person can be completely objective. This is because we all speak from social positions. Our identities affect our lived experiences because society attaches certain values to our identities. For example, your gender will affect the way society treats you because we live in a sexist society. My perspective on gender is biased because I'm oppressed because of my gender. My perspective on race is also biased because I'm privileged because of my race. When it comes to mental illness, I'm biased because I'm mentally ill. And when it comes... Oh. I see. And when it comes to sexism, I'm still biased because I benefit from cisgender privilege. From this perspective, nobody can ever argue from an objective or neutral perspective on things like social justice because society treats no identity with neutrality. And this continues. I'll be returning to this in a video about identity politics. I just want to keep reviewing these reasons without commenting or immediately shutting them down. Let's hear her out. Here's the third reason. Striving towards objectivity is used to justify tone policing. I often see privileged people dismiss marginalised people's arguments in the name of objectivity. They may say things like, "I would like to have an objective discussion with you, but your tone is too angry and rude," or "How am I supposed to take your argument seriously when you're so emotional?" This happens to me a lot when I discuss queer issues, when I discuss corrective rape, biphobia, and the mistreatment of queer people in the workplace. It's so much more than a debate to me. The memory or the threat of those things happening to me is incredibly unnerving. For this reason, I'm emotionally attached to the debate, something which could cause me to seem angry or rude. Glorifying objectivity leads to our belief that being emotional during debates is a bad thing, but it isn't a bad thing. As mentioned before, being emotional when you're speaking about sensitive issues like social justice, especially if you're personally affected by the issue at hand, is totally natural and normal. But when people are emotional during discussions, they're often tone policed. This means that their views are seen as irrelevant because their tone comes off as angry, rude, or upset, even though they have every right to be hurt in those situations. So to reiterate, this person wants the right to become emotional during arguments and objects to any tone policing that would seek to moderate her behaviour. Again, I'm not going to comment.
No, I don't agree with that.
Then why the fuck did you accept the position?
Because
Who the fuck hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down! If that is what you think about being ambassador, you should step down!
And this brings us fourth and finally to this. Sometimes emotions are just as important as facts. Glorifying objectivity often leads us to dismiss people's emotions. We often see emotion as the antithesis of cool, sound, calm reasoning and rational debate. Here's the thing. Oppression doesn't simply affect people in political and economic ways. It also affects a person's emotional and psychological health. The point is that oppression affects your feelings. Feelings affect how we make decisions, how we interact with others, how we view others. Feelings are important because psychology is important. Because of this, dismissing emotions in social justice debates erases a key aspect of oppression and hinders our understanding of one another's experiences. Rather than dismissing emotions or seeing them as a sign of a lack of objectivity, we need to engage with them. We need to understand their feelings. Lived experiences and psychology are absolutely important in activism and social justice. After all, social justice is about human experience. It's absurd, violent even, to discuss human experiences while leaving out such an important part of our humanity.
Are you experiencing oppression? Don't smile at me, bitch. What you want?
And so it ends. Now I want you to think about what would be the real consequences of a society built along the lines that Sian Ferguson has outlined here. A society in which objectivity is seen as a symptom of privilege, in which everyone is biased, in which attempts at objective fact-checking are seen as a form of tone policing, and in which emotions are viewed as being just as important as facts. And I ask you, is that the world you want to live in? Of all the concepts I have discussed in this series to date, it is this one with which I have the biggest problems. The concept is not difficult. If you are a man in a patriarchal society, you have privilege, while women are at disadvantage as the victims of prejudice and oppression. If you are white in a white racist society, you have privilege, while those of ethnic minority groups are at disadvantage as the victims of prejudice and oppression. And so on with other binaries such as heterosexual and homosexual, cisgender and transgender, and so on and so forth. The idea is that in situations concerning these matters, the privileged party should essentially hear out the oppressed party, and because they know the issue better than you do because of their subjective experiences, you should also more or less defer to them when it comes to questions of how to deal with this matter. Now this, I think, more than any other theoretical construct, has caused a huge amount of problems, both theoretical and practical. I'll deal with the practical problem very quickly. The majority are effectively being told to butt out of the conversation and defer to people who know better. That is the crux of it. Unfortunately, majorities have the habit of being most people, and since we live in democracies in which freedom of speech and equality are valued, and in which many important decisions are made by the process of voting, a strategy of enacting change by way of trying to tell the majority to shut up seems to me to be a stunningly ineffective way of fighting for progressive change. I mean, as strategies go, it's just rubbish. Our society depends on bringing people on side, and here you are insisting on the fact that we are not equal and cannot talk about this topic as equal interlocutors. Now, I don't think you need a PhD in behavioural psychology to know that most people just aren't going to be cool with that. So before I get into any theoretical problems, practically it's a really bad way of bringing people on side because you are insisting on divisions of power. I mean, one alternative method of fighting against perceived injustice might be trying to defeat the arguments of the supposed oppressors on the equal playing field of reasoned debate. But of course, they would argue that reasoned debate gives an unfair advantage on the privileged because they can afford to be more dispassionate. I don't really understand where this might go practically. The rule of law must surely be predicated at the end of the day on evidence and not on subjective feeling. I mean, isn't justice all about proving something beyond reasonable doubt? If there is injustice, I don't see why the argument can't be made despite strong feelings. The second, more theoretical objection gets at something that is really problematic. I happened to be foolish enough recently to get involved in an online debate with a privileged theory monger who had the audacity of accusing me of being dishonest. Let's listen to what he has to say. Whatever you think, it's, and he's referring to yours truly here, him who's being dishonest. I mentioned this before. When we talk about racism, in fact, when most people on the left talk about racism, social justice warriors or otherwise, they are not describing, screw the N-words racism. We say, you are saying a racist thing. We don't suggest you are aggressive towards non-whites. Racism is systematic and structural, not just people who show explicit aggression towards blacks. It's implicit far more than explicit, and it's not easy to shed for any of us. Now, a person who suggests you have called them an explicit racist when what you actually said is that they are supporting racist narratives, or they are using racist language, or are expressing racist things, is trying to shut down the discussion by pretending to be outraged. In a way, they are indulging in exactly the same language policing they accuse others of doing. Now let's examine the consequences of what this person is saying. First, he imagines, and I say imagines because he actually has no idea of my skin colour, that I am white and therefore enjoy de facto privilege, and I am also male and therefore enjoy de facto privilege by virtue of my gender as well. This is not a symptom of anything I've said or done or what has actually gone on, but rather something that is structural, a facet of ideology. The whole of the culture is racist, therefore I, as one of its passive subjects, I'm implicitly racist. Oh, and I'm implicitly sexist too. Especially because I accuse feminists of believing in some very silly things and polluting sensible discourse with pernicious and insensible ideas. The view of my interlocutor here has far-reaching consequences. It reminds me somewhat of the old Christian concept of original sin. I mean, it doesn't really matter what I've done, the deeds, the actual things I've done and said in my life. They just do not matter because I'm always already guilty. I'm just privileged and there's nothing I can do about that. Man, what am I meant to do about this? Well, let's see what the official advice says. One characteristic of the act of checking one's privilege is that it isn't a single action, it's not a correction to one's behaviour, after which the issue is never addressed again. Rather, it is the application of critical thinking skills to one's social and cultural advantages and how they interact with others in the world, performed consistently over time. Privilege is not like baggage, checked in and then collected. It is more like a threat that must constantly be kept in check by a self-aware and responsible person. Culture does not stop advantaging privileged people. Privileged people cannot simply stop being critical of the culture that gives them these gifts at the expense of others in their community. One of the real problems with this way of thinking is that even if progress is made on any of the real-world issues surrounding social injustice, even if long-standing goals of equality of rights and opportunities and so on are achieved, it doesn't really matter, because privilege and prejudice are no longer located in acts or laws or institutions or even in individual utterances. They just are. They are just all around us as an unchanging, structuring principle. And this, my friend, is what happens when you dislocate theory from the real world. The real world ceases to matter. Even discourse ceases to matter because the structure is always already surrounding us and there's nothing you or me or anyone else can do about it. So the answer is, if you, like me, enjoy privilege, you should just shut up and check that privilege. Don't go looking for evidence or facts or anything else. Just be a good ally and listen to the voices of the oppressed victims of this awful ideology we all live under. And that's how the struggle is going to be won. Since the election of Donald Trump, I have found myself locked in arguments with a number of increasingly insane social justice warriors. I have during this time spotted patterns of behaviour and underhanded tactics that these illiberal people use to squirm away from honest and reasoned debate. Therefore, I have devised this playbook as a guide to slaying these utter twats.
So I've just heard.
I have identified 6 foul moves and have suggestions for methods with which to counter them. Number 1. The number 1 tactic of the social justice warrior is labelling. The social justice warrior likes nothing more than to pull out a label. This will, of course, be something bad, something that they will then try to use to discredit your opinion. It can come in many forms: racist, Tory, conservative, white supremacist, sexist, homophobe. And this is just their standard attack, their normal punch, as it were, when you press the A button. And here are some examples I've picked out. So you can see here, this is why you can't have meaningful dialogue with Trump supporters. So, I guess we know one more easily duped Trump voter. Go back to Breitbart. Here, do not get drawn into pointing out that you didn't vote for Trump or that you do not read Breitbart. This is what they want, so then they can turn around and accuse you of lying. You then get sidetracked into the issue of whether or not you are lying. This is a trap. It is derailment. You must ignore any and all attempts to do so. If you acknowledge it in any way, just flag it up as derailment. Just say, look, this is not relevant. I am not getting drawn into a debate about whether I am or am not a white supremacist. Nonsense! Concentrate on the damn point. The second tactic that they use is whataboutery. Now, this is quite ironic, given that the term was coined by the left as a shield against criticism of their own outrageous hypocrisy, but they themselves will frequently pull out a whatabout example as a juvenile and ultimately futile attempt to try to deflect attention away from themselves. I'll just give you one example here. How is that different from Gamersgaters threatening to bomb events women were speaking at? Now, this is utter bollocks. This is a means of getting you to try to address a topic other than the one that you were talking about. It's derailment yet again, and a means of them avoiding the demand to make actual counter-arguments. So, flag this up when you encounter it, or simply ignore it. Do not get sidetracked into talking about something that gamers Gate did in 2011 or something that some conservative group did somewhere else. It's nothing to do with you. You do not represent another side. You're just attacking their twattery. Number 3, a third tactic used by the mundane minds of the left is suddenly to get super pedantic and technical about some term or other. Do not get drawn into petty arguments about the definitions of words or some other pedantic point of grammar. Here are some examples. Fascism is mob rule. Am I missing something here? Sounds sloppy. And here's another one. My attempt to discuss sugar beet the other day feels like it was derailed. That was me speaking. And here this person says, do attempts have feelings now? I'll find a safe space for yours. Toughen up, attempt. Now in the first example here, this absolute charlatan attempted to derail my point, and the point I was making was that the regressive left behaved no better than fascists by descending into mob rule. He tried to derail that by trying to make an argument that mob rule and fascism are not exactly the same thing. In the second, this utter pillock with whom I was speaking quotes my line and then tries to quibble with my syntax. Essentially, you'll see that the subject of the sentence that I said is missing. I should have said something like, I think my argument, but instead, I was writing in a hurry in shorthand and lopped off the I think. This is mere pedantry. It is another diversion tactic that constitutes derailment. This again gets you onto a topic other than the one under discussion. Do not fall for it. It is a trap. Fourth, this is the fourth tactic, source quibbling. If you post data from some place, a common social justice warrior tactic is immediately to question the source. Social justice warriors like nothing more than to sidetrack from debating the actual issue at hand by using these heuristics. For example, if you post a bunch of articles, let's say 10 different links all pointing to the same thing, if just one of those articles is on the social justice warrior blacklist of right-wing publications, some clown in their member will highlight the fact that you linked to the one source and then use it to discredit the whole argument. You must try to work around this as follows. And here are my rules for working around this method of argumentation. Only post from official sources of data. Wherever possible, try to link to the original report and not to some newspaper write-up of it. 2. If you are forced to use media links rather than research institute or government links, wherever possible, use ones which cannot possibly be accused of pro-right-wing bias. BBC News, for example, would be a good link. Finally, never link to these sources, okay? So in the traditional media, of course, in this country, in the UK, we have The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Telegraph. Over in the United States, you have Fox News and the Washington Times. Never link to any of those. And then, of course, there's the alt media. Never quote from Breitbart, Drudge Report, Free Domain Radio. You can see the list of... just use your common sense. If it is a site associated ideologically with the right or the alt-right, it's going to be on their bad list. They're not going to accept it. They will use the fact that the information comes from that place in order to try to discredit the entire argument, okay? The left-wing mind functions in a very simple and binary way. Either people and institutions are good, that means they are acceptable, or they are bad, evil, unacceptable, compromised. So try to be diligent in reducing the risk of getting sidetracked by giving them scope to attack the source. Do what you can to avoid linking any of the places that I've just mentioned. The leftist keeps vast lists of these good and bad things in their heads and reject everything and anything that comes from a bad list. This can include people as well as publications. Because of this, it can sometimes hit you unawares. For example, when I quoted Sam Harris on the issue of identity politics and its ills, instead of engaging with the argument, instead I got back this. Sam Harris is a massive tool. Sam Harris is worse than a fraud, he's often quite boring. Sam Harris is an idiot and a fraud. So clearly Sam Harris has done something to find himself on the bad list. Now, when this happens, you must insist that they attack the argument, not the man. Do not get drawn into an argument about whether or not the person is good. I couldn't give a shit if Sam Harris is an idiot. I couldn't give a shit. This is derailment. It is a diversion. Insist that they address the argument being made. Number 5. Since they will seek to discredit your sources, even if you cite them from a credible source, for example, recently, when discussing immigration policy, and specifically I was talking about the need for social cohesion and the importance of integrating migrant communities with native communities, I quoted to back up my point, a report done by Dame Casey, which was a UK government report on this very issue. Now, here, look at what I got. Oliver Kahn was brutal on the Casey report. The Casey review was a vapid and ill-conceived intervention by a public servant with a record of superficial statements. So here, a leftist has already attacked a government source and therefore managed to get the source itself onto the banned list. Nothing you can do in this scenario other than to kind of sit back and look at how, when faced with actual evidence, they have to find ways to try to discredit that evidence. In the second example, I used a now quite widely cited Chatham House poll, which is a poll about attitudes to Donald Trump's travel ban across Europe. It broadly found that people across Europe were broadly in favour of this ban. Now, because the data did not confirm to their point of view, leftists were forced to try to discredit this report. They were not able to attack the source because, of course, Chatham House is as reputable as it gets, so instead we got this. It was an online survey that somehow managed to get equal amounts of people in all 10 of those countries, despite never telling us their methodology. It basically looks like a study I BS'd in a first-year stats course because it was worth 5%. And here this other utter twat says they're probably in the minorities anyway. It's a BS poll. And look at how he spelt poll there. Maybe he was punning on the fact that over 70% of Polish people seem to be quite up for the Muslim ban. Now, in these cases, rather than get drawn into questions of methodology from your sources, instead, insist on data for their counterclaims. Insist that they provide figures and statistics to counter the ones that you have provided from very reputable sources. And then, if they do provide data, then use their own questions, their own ways of discrediting the study that you have cited back on their data. This is important since it will expose the fact that they are being driven to make their arguments because of their emotional reflexes and not because of the actual facts of the matter. All of these things are clearly knee-jerk. Oh, I don't want to listen to the facts because they don't mesh with my worldview. Well, fuck you. Those are the facts. 6. And I am somebody who really needs to take stock of this 6th rule here. Do not lose your temper or be provoked into calling them names back. This will be taken as a victory for the social justice warrior because they will ignore all of the provocation, abuse, derailment attempts and all of the other total shit they've done and instead focus on the one time that you let your emotions get the better of you. You must be, as the Zen monk, resist the urge to call names. Resist the urge to get angry. Focus only on the topic at hand. Never get personal. Never get drawn into flame wars. Use these rules that I have devised in this playbook consistently, and you will force the social justice warrior either into honest debate. If they still fail to argue coherently or honestly, then at least you have exposed their behaviour for what it is. Your chief goal should be only to insist on sticking to the argument at hand and to expose all attempts at deviating from this. Hello all, I'm the academic agent. George Orwell once said that so much of left-wing thought is kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot. I sometimes wonder if they know the reason that they're playing with fire at all. It's because their ultimate goal is burning down the house. In the words of David Byrne, watch out. You might get what you're after. It was also George Orwell who coined the term newspeak in his novel 1984. As you'll recall, of course, under Big Brother's regime, it was the totalitarian language created to meet the ideological requirements of English socialism. Newspeak is a controlled language of restricted grammar and limited vocabulary, a linguistic design meant to limit the freedom of thought, personal identity, self-expression, free will, that ideologically threatens the regime of Big Brother and the party, who thus criminalise such concepts as thought crime, contradictions of Ingsoc orthodoxy. Now in this video I want to explore the various ways in which the political left have continually used this technique in the real world, in both Britain and in the USA, since at least the 1960s. Now you might think that this is a recent phenomenon coinciding with the rise of the modern day social justice warrior, but alas, the left have always done this. And it is not a new observation. Many conservative commentators have pointed it out over the years, and I will be drawing from some of them here. It just so happens that I have been reading some of this stuff recently, and I wanted to share it with you. First up, here is the philosopher Roger Scruton in his marvellous book, Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, Thinkers of the New Left, which I think sets up this topic nicely. Ordinary language warms and softens. Newspeak freezes and hardens. An ordinary discourse generates out of its own resources the concepts that Newspeak forbids. Fair, unfair. Just, unjust. Right, duty. Honest, dishonest. Legal, illegal. Yours, mine. Such distinctions, which belong to the free exchange of feelings, opinions and goods, also when freely expressed and acted upon, create a society in which order is spontaneous and not planned, and in which the unequal distribution of assets arises by an invisible hand. Newspeak does not merely impose a plan, it also eliminates the discourse through which human beings can live without one. If justice is referred to in Newspeak, it is not the justice of individual dealings, but social justice, the kind of justice imposed by a plan, which invariably involves depriving individuals of things that they have acquired by fair dealing in the market. In the opinion of almost all thinkers who I discuss in what follows, government is the act of seizing and then redistributing the things to which all citizens are supposedly entitled. It is not the expression of a pre-existing social order shaped by our free agreements and our natural disposition to hold ourselves and our neighbours to account. It is the creator and manager of a social order framed according to an idea of social justice and imposed on the people by a series of top-down decrees. Intellectuals are naturally attracted by the idea of a planned society in the belief that they will be in charge of it. In this way, it seems to me it is not an accident that the triumph of leftist ways of thinking has so often led to totalitarian government. The pursuit of abstract social justice goes hand in hand with the view that power struggles and relations of domination express the truth of our social condition, and that the consensual customs, inherited institutions and systems of law that have brought peace to real communities are merely the disguises worn by power. The goal is to seize that power and to use it to liberate the oppressed, distributing all the assets of society according to the just requirements of the plan. Intellectuals who think that way are already rooting out the possibility of compromise. Their totalitarian language does not set out a path of negotiation, but instead divides human beings into innocent and guilty groups. Behind the impassioned rhetoric of the Communist Manifesto, behind the pseudoscience of Marx's labour theory of value, and behind the class analysis of human history, lies a single emotional source: resentment of those who control things. This resentment is both rationalized and amplified by the proof that property owners form a class. According to the theory, the bourgeois class has a shared moral identity, a shared and systematic access to the levers of power, and a shared body of privileges. Moreover, all those good things are acquired and retained through the exploitation of the proletariat, which has nothing to part with except its labour, and which will therefore always be cheated of its just deserts. Now, to illustrate the fact that the left did not just do this in Soviet Russia, but they're doing it here and now, here is Matt Ridley writing in the Times back in July of this year. It feels as if the left has always been better at vocabulary than the right. Capitalism was a word largely invented by the opponents of commerce. The socialist Louis Blanc first used it in its modern sense in 1850, defining it as the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others. Marx and Engels then made it a proper boo word. Ever since, the left has used capitalism to imply that all free market commerce is run by big financiers, with massive investments, rather than merchants and entrepreneurs taking risks on behalf of consumers and driving down prices. For reasons I don't fully understand, the champions of commerce fell in with this scheme and have spent the last century and a half trying to defend the word capitalism instead of commerce or enterprise. Then again, even the market has been successfully tarnished as a word. By allowing this term to represent free exchange between individuals, liberals have appeared to concede that there is a monolithic authority over and against the individual. Yet, paraphrasing Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as the market. There are individual men and women and their families, all of them making goods, providing services, and exchanging them with other individuals and willing buyers and sellers. Likewise, the term Tory for a conservative is generally intended as an insult, as is the term socialist for the Labour person. It remains a puzzle why we have never coined a noun for Labour members. But note that a diligently impartial newscaster on, say, Channel 4 will not hesitate to use Tory Prime Minister to describe Theresa May, but would never call Jeremy Corbyn the socialist leader of the opposition. Now, why is that? Indeed, the right often seems resigned to adopting the vocabulary of the left, words such as capitalism, Tory, poll tax. The current success of the word austerity seems to stem from a too successful decision by George Osborne to be honest about the public finances in 2010. Greens are into this too. Who redefined renewables as clean energy? The propagandists have been so relentless in its use that most journalists have now stopped putting quotation marks around it. They went along with the rebadging of global warming as climate change to sound less mild and to take credit for blizzards as well as heat waves. Then there is Islamic vocabulary. According to Azra Numani, writing in the Washington Post in 2015, there was a deliberate policy decision by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to begin trying to control the debate on Islam. This wider corpus throws the label of Islamophobe on pundits, journalists and others who dare to talk about extremist ideology in the religion. The insults may look similar to internet trolling and vitriolic comments you can find on any blog or news site, but they're more coordinated, frightening and persistent. And if true, this deserves more coverage. Now, there is no shortage of examples of any of this that we might draw from. In one of my favourite books, The Vision of the Anointed, Thomas Sowell devotes a whole chapter to exposing the verbal games and verbal virtuosity of the left. I won't read it all out here, but rather I will pick out a few of my favourite illustrative examples. He says, in light of the underlying assumptions of the prevailing vision, it may be easier to see why the particular vocabulary used by the United is what it is. The swirl of their buzzwords, access, stigma, progressive, diversity, crisis, etc., shows a discernible pattern. What these innumerable buzzwords have in common is that they either 1. Preempt issues rather than debate them, 2. Set the anointed and the benighted on different moral and intellectual planes, or 3. Evade the issue of personal responsibility. So let's have a look at the first one then, and that is crisis. He says, the word crisis, for example, is a preemptive word used for its prospective political effect rather than for its contemporary or retrospective accuracy. When the anointed say that there is a crisis, this means that something must be done, and it must be done simply because the anointed want it done. This word becomes one of many substitutes for evidence or logic. So do words like genuine need or self-contradictory phrases like people living below subsistence. This is another example of newspeak from Sowell. He says, one of the never-ending crusades of the anointed is for more public service. Like so many of the special buzzwords of the anointed, this phrase does not mean what the straightforward sense of the word seems to say. Not every service to the public is a public service in this newspeak. For example, those who deliver tons of life-sustaining food to supermarkets are not engaged in public service, as the anointed use the term. Neither are those who build a roof over people's heads or produce the clothes on people's backs. Those who perform those vital services are activated by the incentives of the marketplace, perhaps even by greed, another fashionable buzzword that puts the anointed and the benighted on different moral planes. The call for more public service is then a call for more people to work in jobs not representing the preferences of the public as revealed through the marketplace, but the preferences of third parties enforced through government and paid for by the power of taxation. Sometimes work for foundations and other non-profit organisations is also included in public service. What is crucial is that public service not be service defined by the public itself through its choices of how to spend its own money in market transactions, but defined for them by third-party elites. Otherwise, the most valuable and even life-saving activities are not worthy of the benediction public service, while making oneself a nuisance to other people with door-to-door solicitations in an activity worthy of that verbal aura, when it is in a cause favoured by the anointed. Forcing the public to pay for art calculatingly insulting to the public sensibilities is also a public service, as the anointed define the term, and a failure to pay is censorship in this same lexicon, regardless of how free those artists remain to produce and sell their products to those willing to pay with their own money. Imagine how Paul Joseph Watson would feel about that one. What is crucial about the concept of public service as used by the anointed is that it must be defined by third parties and not by the public itself. So this is another example from Sowell. He talks about access. Now, people are often said to lack access to various jobs, educational institutions or credit, when in fact they may not have behaved or performed in a way that would enable them to meet the same standards that others meet. Access is just one of a number of ex-ante expressions. Opportunity, bias, and glass ceiling, for example, are used to describe ex-post results in such a way as to preempt the whole question as to why those results turned out the way they did. If a job ceiling is glass, for example, that says it is invisible, and the assertion must be accepted without evidence. Implicit in much of this verbiage is the notion that the rules were rigged for or against some individual group. But whether or to what extent this is true is precisely the issue that should be argued, not circumvented by a verbal sleight of hand. And indeed, this has happened here in Britain just in this past week. The Guardian has been running wild with a claim that only 3% of the top 1,000 most powerful jobs in the FTSE 100 are occupied by so-called BAME people. Where did that phrase BAME come from all of a sudden? Incidentally, it means Black, Asian and minority ethnic. Anyway, as if to prove Sowell's point in real time, they make all of these arguments, and that 3% number doesn't look right to these Guardian journalists. So they think it's a crisis, it's shocking, we must urgently act to fix this terrible problem. But of course, no one ever asks why. For example, 70% of NFL stars are black, when only 12.7% of the US population are black, or why only 37% of British doctors are white, when over 90% of the British population is white. As it happens, British Indians and Asians massively over-index in that field, even though they make up precisely 0% of the national football team, which is over 80% black, over 10 times the national percentage of black people. Now, such statistics are not what our Guardian journalists are looking for, which is what makes them so maddeningly dishonest. If their quest for cosmic justice was a real thing, they'd be wondering why the percentages in those industries don't exactly mirror the national demographic averages. But of course, this quest only works in one direction and only has one purpose. Another great example from Sowell is the way that the left talks about progress. A whole family of self-flattering words serves as benedictions for the vision of the anointed. Progress and progressive are prominent examples. But everyone is for progress by definition. They differ only on specifics, though these differences may be extreme and even violent. Words like progress or progressive preempt these specific issues by arbitrarily assuming the differential desirability of one's own preferred changes without having to debate substance or even acknowledge its relevance. And elsewhere, and this is one of my favourite bits of this book, he says, perhaps the purest example of an argument without an argument is to say that something is inevitable. This is an inherently irrefutable argument as long as any time remains in the future. Only in the last fraction of a second of the existence of the universe could anyone refute that claim, and perhaps they would have other things on their mind by then. And I've actually come across this in my own YouTube adventures when I've been debating with various communists and Marxists who, think that the end of capitalism is inevitable, and then we get into some sort of science fiction debate. Anyway, whether particular policies are favoured or opposed, there are opaque proclamations of this sort which substitute for arguments. And whether a policy is favoured or opposed, it may be currently existing or non-existent. In each of these four cases, there are proclamations that substitute for arguments as illustrated in this table. Now have a look at this. If the left favour something and it already exists, then it's here to stay. And if it doesn't exist, they argue that it is inevitable that it will come to be. But if they oppose a particular policy and it already exists, they decry it as being outmoded. And if it doesn't exist, and it's, let's say, a plan the Tories want to bring in or the Republicans, it is dismissed as being unrealistic. It is one of the signs of our times that such proclamations are so widely accepted in view of arguments, but only when used in support of the prevailing vision of the anointed. I'll stop there. In short, the left's entire rhetorical strategy is to argue entirely without reason or evidence through these verbal games, and it is designed to appeal to emotion. Sowell actually lists these strategies. I've just typed up a few of them here. Verbal preemption, that's this tactic of basically prejudging something before you even come to debate it. The second one is disdaining the benighted. That's basically Hillary calling all of Trump's supporters deplorables. You know, you're well familiar with the practice of disdaining the benighted. You know, the opponents of the left are either stupid or racist or, you know, uneducated or hicks or whatever phrases they want to use. There's also this question of feasibility, and you'll see this a lot when Jeremy Corbyn is debating. They always speak in terms of their goals or the outcomes they want to achieve, never in terms of the specifics of how they're actually going to achieve them, never in terms of the actual process. And, you know, Labour are maddeningly difficult to pin down on these things. You also see it over in America as well. You know, Bernie Sanders a couple of weeks ago had that whole speech about how he wants to launch single-payer universal healthcare, but so vague on how he was actually going to achieve it. Then there's the cosmic viewpoint. That is the quest for cosmic justice that I was talking about, this idea that we're going to somehow achieve universal equality, that you know, national demographics are going to somehow line up exactly with all of the percentages of people within various different industries. You know, 50% of women are going to be computer programmers, etc., etc. Then there is, of course, naming names, this tactic of labeling. That is what Matt Ridley was talking about in the Times, really, with you know, how capitalism or Tory, these are insulting labels. In fact, the right in general is a kind of preemptive insult. And then there is, of course, verbal inflation. And this is a tactic that you're all familiar with, where a given word or a given area keeps on expanding way beyond its normal definition. For example, violence is one of the one that Sowells talks about, how words are now violent. Or how about rape? That's another one where the definition of what counts as rape keeps on expanding. And again, all of you here on Sargon's channel will know about that. Now, what are we going to do about this? I think Ben Shapiro has the right idea. You must systematically deny the left all of this turf if you're ever in a political discussion with them. Redefine all of their buzzwords in plain English. Insist on defining it in the way that makes it abundantly clear what they actually mean, because the word in question will undoubtedly obscure the true meaning of what their intentions are. For example, if they are complaining about the shocking fact that some particular group isn't represented in some particular job, ask them directly why they expect to see national demographics mirrored in particular industries. Hit them with the stats I mentioned earlier on. Ask them why they aren't concerned that only 37% of doctors are white when 90% of people are white in this country. Put them on the back foot. Force them into revealing their true intentions. Deny them any form of moral high ground. When they say things which preemptively attack you, preemptively attack them. And here in the UK, when we have a sneering, virtue-signalling socialist twat like Jeremy Corbyn, the absolute boy, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, on the rise, this has never, ever been more important. They want to paint their opponents as evil. Make no mistake, they are totalitarians, and we need to do everything possible to combat them at this time. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I am the Academic Agent. Come along to my YouTube channel where I encourage you to subscribe, watch a few videos, leave a few comments. We have some lively discussions over there. And if you want to talk to me even more, I am also on Twitter at Academic Agent. So long for now.
Wind, water, heart, go planet!
By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet!
Captain Planet, he's our hero, gonna take pollution
People on the political left do not see politics as a battle of ideas. They do not care about individual policies, whether they work or indeed their effects on real people. Rather, they see politics as a mission to change the world for the better. It is not a battle between this idea or that idea, but rather a righteous quest for all that is good. Who would oppose such a thing? Of course, only evil people would. This is why you will see the Tories routinely described as being the spawn of Satan, who literally stand for killing children. In this video, I want us to play a little game. I want for everyone watching this to try to put yourself into their mindset and to see the world as they do. To do this, I have designed this thought experiment. Here is the King's Court. The old king has died and left no heir, and it is our job as guardians of the realm not only to pick a new king, but also to populate his court so that we can have wise counsel during his reign. In each case, the Council of Mysterious Elders have provided us only two choices, so let's go, shall we? First, we must pick the king. Choice number 1 is Harry Potter.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Stand up, feel the beat, and let's do the happy dance. I'm so happy, that's why I clap my hands, because I'm feeling happy.
He has pledged to make the kingdom a better place. He stands for hope, honesty, peace in our time, and says he wants to make everybody happier. Choice number 2 is Lex Luthor. He has detailed a very comprehensive plan to boost the economy by devising better incentives for free enterprise to flourish. He has said that working men and women will find themselves better off and will keep more money in their pockets if he is able to institute a set of tax reforms. Let's cast our votes. Who should be the new king? Lex Luthor or Harry Potter? Next up, someone needs to run the treasury. Choice number 1 is Pinkie Pie of My Little Pony fame.
I'm so happy, that's why I twist my hips, because I'm feeling happy.
She says that everyone should have more money. She doesn't think it's right that some people have more. Everyone should have the same. Pinkie Pie promises also that she will spend money on cakes for everyone in the kingdom, because everyone likes cakes.
I'll just measure the baking powder for you. And when the first layer cools, you can drizzle some of the ganache over it. And don't forget to beat the egg whites for the meringue!
Choice number 2 is the penguin. The Penguin supports Lex Luthor's plan of devising better incentives for business and also thinks that tax cuts will make people better off in the long run. Let's cast our vote, shall we? Who should be the new Master of Treasure? Pinkie Pie or the Penguin? Now it's on to Law and Order. Choice number 1 is Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney.
Objection! Take that! I'm so happy, that's why I'm marching place, because I'm feeling happy.
He says that in his time as a defense lawyer, he's seen too many innocent people sent down for crimes that they did not commit. He thinks that this is wrong and wants it to stop. Choice number 2 is Mephistopheles, the dark agent of Satan. thinks that the letter of the law should be followed to the nearest dot in the Constitution, that fair legal contracts should be binding, and that the law courts must follow only the established rules, making no special cases for anyone. So let's cast our votes. Who should be our Lord Chief Justice? Phoenix Wright or Mephistopheles? Military matters now, and choice number 1 is Obi-Wan Kenobi, a veteran of several intergalactic wars.
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Happy is a feeling I like to feel, and I like to spread it too. I'm happy just to be here singing the song and dancing along with you.
He says that he senses the dark side is on the rise in the world again, and that we must take the fight to them. Choice number 2 is M. Bison. He says that there's probably been enough war already, and there'll always be some evil in the world, so we best not get involved in any fights right now. We are better off, according to Bison, concentrating on the defence of our own borders. So let's cast our votes. Who should be our new commander of the military? Obi-Wan Kenobi or M. Bison? Finally, on to education. Here, choice number 1 is John Keating from the Dead Poets Society.
But only in their dreams can men be truly free. 'Twas always thus, and always thus will be.
Oh yeah. Dance your happy up, dance your happy down, dance your happy side to side and dance it all around.
Keating has not released a comment about his policies, but his class did perform an art installation together. They were quoted as saying, "O captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells, rise up for the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills." Choice number 2 is Kitano from Battle Royale. His education policy is about the importance of discipline in the classroom and why children should know the histories of their countries. So why don't we cast our votes? John Keating or Kitano? So tell me, what did your court look like? Recently, one of my favourite right-wing YouTubers, Rocking Mr. E, made a great video called The Fallacies of the Left. This is one of my favourite topics, and indeed I've touched on it before many times in previous videos, such as this early effort, a playbook with which to counter dishonest and illiberal SJW tactics, and more recent ones like Inside the Mind of a Leftist and The Language Games of the Left. In this video, I want to try to put them all together in a compendium and also add in some more. I want to flesh out fully the way the left advance their arguments. First of all, let's take the ones that Rocking Mr. E rightfully notes.
The primary fallacy of the left is an appeal to emotion. If an appeal to emotion fails, the next step will invariably be an appeal to authority. If all else fails, the left will avoid addressing your arguments entirely in one of two ways. The first is an appeal to ridicule, where they simply mock and ridicule your argument in any way they can, to make it appear as though it has no substance. This usually accompanies another fallacy, an ad hominem, where your character is attacked. Last but not least, the left will revert to one more fallacy as a means to wear you down. Argumentum ad nauseam, or argument to the point of repetition.
So we have appeal to emotion, appeal to authority, ad hominem, an argument by repetition. Now let's add these to the ones I outline in my anti-SJW playbook. The second tactic that they use is whataboutery. Now this is quite ironic given that the term was coined by the left as a shield against criticism of their own outrageous hypocrisy, but they themselves will frequently pull out a whatabout example as a juvenile and ultimately futile attempt to try to deflect attention away from themselves. A third tactic used by the mundane minds of the left is suddenly to get super pedantic and technical about some term or other. This is the fourth tactic, source quibbling. I am somebody who really needs to take stock of this sixth rule here. Do not lose your temper or be provoked into calling them names back. And so we're up to 9, but there are some advanced leftist tactics I want to look at specifically in some more detail. The first is the way they reframe something using language so as to foreclose the possibility of objection. This is actually known as the framing fallacy. In order to understand this properly, we have to consider what I said in my 2 previous videos. The left is constantly trying to tell themselves a story, and that story is that they are a hero who has sworn to protect victim groups against a group of villains. So for any leftist argument, you need to look out for this triangle. They are obviously always the hero of their own story, but you need to spot who they are trying to cast as the victims and who they are trying to cast as the villains. And once you spot that, you can see it seeping into their language in all sorts of hidden and insidious ways. It can be subtle. I actually saw a great example of this today when I got an email inviting me to a conference on transgender rights. Let's take a look at it. You can pause and read this in full in your own time. I just want to highlight some of the close language control here, which advertises the overt leftist agenda which is disguised therein. The first big red alarm is the word equality. Look at it there, so righteous, so glorious, and so seemingly innocuous. But it does not exactly say what equality means. Equal to what? To whom? And immediately here we have our victim group, the transgender people, and by implication we have a villain group, that is all the non-transgender people, denying them equality. And of course, the heroes are the ones speaking at this conference. That didn't take long, did it? But let's look further down to the agenda itself. Another huge alarm. Progress and next steps. Look at this insidious bit of language control. So now any step towards transgender equality, as defined by these people, is a step towards progress, and anyone who might be against it is de facto against progress, and therefore siding with the villain group. Note also how next steps gives this the air of inevitability. Like all progress, this is going to happen. It's just a case of finding the right steps. This is some top drawer framing by the people who wrote this agenda. Next line, recognition and rights. Now we're in the language of the civil rights movement. If you stand against this, you are literally standing against Martin Luther King himself. And to cap it, of course, this is inclusive. If you're against this, you are against inclusivity. Notice how, by this point, anyone who is broadly against what is happening is thoroughly denied participation in this discussion. The conclusions are already made. And there it is in the next line. Barriers. If you're against this, you are a barrier to progress. And you're against inclusivity. You get the picture. This framing fallacy is one of the left's most successful and darkest tactics. Let me mention another one now, the guilt by association fallacy. They do this so often and with such abandon, you might not even notice it anymore. The poster boy for the guilt by association fallacy currently is David Duke, because if David Duke endorses something, then that must mean that thing is irrevocably bad, right? It's tainted. Let's try it out, shall we? David Duke endorses the GOP tax plan. David Duke thinks that milk is white. David Duke thinks that Captain Kirk is the best character on Star Trek. David Duke thinks Breaking Bad is a great TV show. David Duke believes that 2 + 2 = 4. You get the picture. Another one, or rather two, and these really do drive me nuts, is the ecological fallacy, and its flip side, the exception fallacy. The left switch between these with reckless abandon. I touched on this in one of my earliest videos, One Exception Disproves the Rule. The most egregious example in recent memory was when James Damore was fired from Google for pointing out that, on average, more men choose to spend their time doing computer programming than women. The left first en masse accused him of the ecological fallacy. That is, they accuse him of suggesting that because of this average tendency, no women could be computer programmers. They thought that he was saying that women couldn't be computer programmers. And then, in a move that had me tearing my hair out, en masse committed the exception fallacy by pointing out that Ada Lovelace was a coder. This is so bloody infuriating. Not only are they routinely committing these crimes against logic and basic statistics, they are doing it in the smuggest manner possible, as if this is a real gotcha. They are so profoundly lacking in self-awareness. In fact, I am convinced that the concept of mansplaining is projection, because the worst mansplainers ever are people like this woman who wrote this Guardian article. I mean, look at the tone of that. Anyway, the last one I want to mention is not really a fallacy as such, but a systematic error in thinking. It's one that Thomas Sowell often discusses. In fact, he wrote a whole book about it, the failure to think beyond stage one. This is because the leftist analysis is always synchronic, that is, it is always static and frozen at a moment in time. So when Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell make their budget plans, they don't think about the impact that their own policies might have. This is because they don't think about incentives. They assume that the economy, as it is right now, will continue being this way, even if they, for example, change the tax rate or start renationalising whole industries. It's like a part of their brain is actually missing. Anyway, that's quite enough. Our list of leftist fallacies is now up to 14. I'd like to thank Son of Tiamat, Cult of the Lich, Charles Vincent, and Edward Darrah. Oh, and one thing more. I am aware of what Patreon has done with their fees, and I think it's scandalous. Because of this, I've promptly set up a Maker Support account. Some people have already switched over. Patreon are about to find out that the free market is a real bitch, and it is terribly unforgiving. If you want to support me, you can do it over there on Maker Support, and I'll be very grateful for anything that you could donate. Thank you very much.
Sometimes you do not realize your own strength.
open door. You are not a radical. Dear leftists, if you are fighting for a cause with massive institutional and financial backing, you are not a radical. Dear leftists, you have no skin in the game. You take no risks. Yours is not the politics of radicalism. Yours is the politics of conformity. Dear leftists, you take no risks. You have no skin in the game. If your politics could be summed up by a corporate HR poster, you are not a radical. You are a patsy of the status quo. You take no risks. You have no skin in the game. Dear leftists, stop cosplaying as if you're part of some sort of rebellion. You're a coward. Why don't you wake up, pretentious, entitled, and middle class? You are the useful idiot of power. You have no skin in the game. Pretentious, entitled, and middle class. Stop cosplaying as if you're part of some sort of rebellion. Dear leftists, you're a herd creature. You seek social acceptance. Yours is not the politics of radicalism. Yours is the politics of conformity. Stop cosplaying as if you're part of some sort of rebellion. Yours is not the politics of radicalism. Yours is the politics of conformity. You're a coward. You take no risks. You have no skin in the game. You are the useful idiot of power. If you're pushing at an open door, you are not a radical. Dear leftists, you're a coward. If your politics can be summed up by a corporate HR poster, you are not a radical. You have no skin in the game. You are the useful idiot of power. If you are fighting for a cause with massive institutional and financial backing, you are not a radical. Dear leftists, you seek social acceptance. You are the useful idiot of power. Yours is not the politics of radicalism. Yours is the politics of conformity. You're a herd creature. Stop cosplaying as if you're part of some sort of rebellion. You take no risks. You're a patsy of the status quo. If you're pushing at an open door, you are not a radical. Yours is not the politics of radicalism. Yours is the politics of conformity. You have no skin in the game. You seek social acceptance. You are the useful idiot of power. Why don't you wake up if you are fighting for a cause with massive institutional and financial backing? You are not a radical. Dear leftists,
Number 1. Leftism is the nationalism of foreign people.
Leftism is the nationalism of foreign people.
Number 1. Leftism is the nationalism. Leftism is the nationalism.
Do you condemn what the IRA did?
I condemn all bombing. It's not a good idea. It's terrible what happened.
It's not the question. The question is, do you condemn what the IRA
Number
did?
2. Leftism is a bid for costless social
Leftism is a bid for costless social acceptance.
Leftism is a bid for costless social acceptance. Number 3. Leftism always imposes costs on the majority for the benefit of an outlier. Leftism always imposes costs on the majority for the benefit of an outlier.
Number 4. Leftist attacks are always projection.
Leftist attacks are always projection. Leftist attacks are always projection.
Always projection.
Leftists never answer the question.
Leftists never answer the question. What happens next?
Leftists never answer the question. What happens next? Number 6. Leftist arguments must deny. Leftist arguments must deny reality.
Must deny reality.
Leftist arguments must deny reality.
Must deny reality.
Number 7. Leftist arguments are nearly always short-term, tactical, in the service of winning more power.
Number 8. Leftist arguments are never truly concerned with the thing itself.
Number 9. Leftists will justify any means to achieve their ends. Number 10. Leftist solutions always impose artificial controls.
Okay, folks, so I mentioned on a recent stream that earlier this year I gave a speech to a number of fairly important people in the so-called intellectual dark web at Oxford, and some people wanted me to share this with them. Now, it was recorded, but I never saw that recording make it onto onto YouTube or anywhere else, as far as I know. So what I've done is I've basically recorded my own version, so you guys at least have access to this speech I gave. I've actually weirdly toned it down from the speech I gave on the day, which had all sorts of spiciness in it. Like, for example, at one moment I had to go at Owen Jones and stuff like that. I've taken some of that stuff out because I wanted to keep this under 20 minutes. So anyway, here it is. Hope you enjoy it. When I was a teenager, I read 4 works of literature that would have a lasting impact on me. The first was George Orwell's 1984, which I read in one sitting. Then, when it was finished, I started the whole thing again. I remember that it left me stunned for days on end. The second was Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, which is ultimately a book about the importance of free will in moral decision-making. The third was Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a play about the Salem witch trials in which the protagonist is coerced to confess that he has consorted with the devil. The fourth was Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, which ends with the immortal line, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." On reflection, I think these works of literature inoculated me against the various ideologies of totalitarianism, and perhaps I was primed to become a classical liberal or libertarian thereafter. One common thread in these works is the relationship between language and power. Of course, this is most developed in Orwell. If you recall, in 1984, the subjects of Big Brother were required, through a process of doublethink and newspeak, to reject obvious and self-evident truths, such as 2 + 2 = 4, in favour of false dogma, such as 2 + 2 = 5. Here, language is simply a function of state control, and reality is whatever official doctrine dictates. Those who refuse to comply are branded as thought criminals and sent for re-education. I do not think it is hyperbolic to suggest that this has some contemporary relevance. In the culture war in which we are currently engaged, the first battle to win is the language game. This comes prior to all other issues. Perhaps the number one reason that pro-liberty sentiment has been falling in recent years has been the near-total dominance of socialists on the linguistic field. As long as they can frame the issues on their terms, they will ultimately prime and anchor the general populace to embrace the fallacious arguments used to oppose free markets that we have seen for the past 200 years now. So today I want to focus on how our adversaries, the enemies of liberty, have succeeded in committing linguistic terrorism and suggest some ways of countering them. The key reason for their success has been their superior tactics waging warfare with the spoken word and pen. I will focus on just 4 of these tactics, but there are likely many more. The 4 tactics are: number 1, linguistic inversion; number 2, the Mott and Bailey; number 3, gaslighting; and number 4, the Kafka trap. These methods have been used to bully and corral the defenders of liberty into submission, using nothing but threats and intimidation for the past century. These are all arguments without argument, or as Thomas Sowell put it in the best treatment of this topic before now, verbal preemption. The basic strategy is to shift the register from logos, that is reason and evidence, where it is more difficult to make headway, to ethos and pathos, where rhetoric can sway the passions and overcome logical argumentation. I just want to provide a brief guide to know what you're up against. Otherwise, as one well-known former communist put it, it's Godzilla versus Bambi. Linguistic inversion is when words are defined to mean the exact opposite of their everyday meaning. Let us take a phrase like justice. In everyday English, most people take justice to mean something like reciprocal just desserts. This relies on equality under the rule of law. In other words, everyone is subject to the same rules. This is fairness, but modify it with the word social to form the phrase social justice, and we are left with an idea that certain victim groups should get special exemptions or privileges. In other words, the opposite of what most people take to mean justice. Therefore, virtually every social justice policy is unjust and unfair. For example, the Macpherson Report's famous call to end colourblind policing, now usually called racially sensitive policing, quite literally means that different ethnic groups must be treated differently by the police. How well has that gone? I need only mention grooming gangs in Rotherham to illustrate the point. Then there is affirmative action. In other words, the blatant lowering of entry requirements for certain groups. Despite initial claims that such measures will only be temporary and reams of evidence that it has had deleterious effects wherever it has been tried, the policy persists, especially in American education. Another example of linguistic inversion is, dare I say it, in the language of human rights. It is one thing to say, I have a human right not to be punched in the face by you, but quite another to say that I have a human right for you to give me food, shelter, custom, and so on. Human rights are more properly defined as special privileges conferred upon some persons at the expense of others. Most of what are called human rights are entitlements without obligations. If you are faced with someone playing this game in debate or even in private conversation, I recommend fully spelling out in plain English what they mean every time the phrase is uttered. This may sound pedantic, but it is important both to expose the linguistic concealment involved and to force the person using the term to think. Continuously ask for clarification. For example, if someone ever uses the phrase consumerism, I will always ask them, do you mean individuals buying products that they want at affordable price points? Linguistic inversion is an effective tactic for the enemies of liberty because it puts opponents into a kind of Alice in Wonderland state where up is down and black is white. It is a near constant struggle against the obfuscation and absurdity as demonstrated in a recent debate watched by millions of people between the almost comically nonsensical Slavoj Žižek and Jordan B. Peterson. Despite being quite wise to these games, Peterson still palpably struggled against such organised chaos. His opponent did not even try to be coherent or consistent. Given that most people in most places would not support the policies of the enemies of liberty if they were stripped of the emotive and concealed terms in which they are usually packaged, they rely on a second technique, a form of hoodwinking, which we can call the Mott and Bailey. This essentially relies on the gap between the everyday meaning of the word, let us say justice, and the more esoteric meaning, as in social justice. The first is the stronger position, the Mott. The second is the weaker position, the Bailey. Nobody is going to come out and say that they are against justice. Everyone is for justice, that is, all individuals being treated the same under the law. Very few people are for social justice, that is, some groups being treated differently under the law for whatever reason. The intellectuals rely on this gap to gain support for their unsuspecting marks. However, occasionally a wily opponent may try to point this out to them in a debate, and you will see the intellectual, almost always a creature of cowardice, retreat to the first definition of justice as a kind of cover. Then, later, they quietly shift back to the second definition. Such manoeuvrings can be seen around the word racism, which in everyday parlance is defined as something like prejudice based on race, but in the esoteric lexicon of the intellectual, it is defined as prejudice plus power. This is a classic Mott and Bailey, which can be witnessed on virtually any broadcast of CNN in the past 3 years, or in the tweets of the Labour MP, David Lammy. However, there can be more difficult examples of the Mott and Bailey to spot. Let us take progress, for example. This one is more subtle. Again, everyone is for progress. Even Edmund Burke was for progress. All but the least sensible of us can agree where progress has been made in technological areas. For example, the combine harvester produces a greater output per unit of input than an ox with a plough. This represents a saving of effort and time we can call progress. Similarly, if you look at the cost in average wages measured in time to produce 1 hour of light, no one would doubt that we have made progress. And this is the Mott. However, on social and moral issues, it is not so clear that, let us say, the social policies of Tony Blair and their after effects count as progress. Does anyone really think that the change from the values of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica to the right-on values of Tony Blair is progress? Well, they might, but the point is that unlike the development of the light bulb, it is strongly debatable and a matter of some contention. And this is the Bailey. When intellectuals use progress, they are often relying on the gap between development towards an improved or more advanced condition and what they really mean, which is social or political change in a direction that we like. Why do intellectuals play this Motte and Bailey game to sell their ideas? It is because, in virtually every case, they must conceal the fact that they are making an active bid for power and control. If these bids were made plainly, they would be rejected by most people, so they must be concealed in this way. The best way to deal with this is to call it out and force them to defend the Bailey and not the Motte. Gaslighting is a word from the world of psychology. It is a technique of manipulation to achieve power. Here are 11 warning signs. Number 1, they tell blatant lies. Number 2, they deny they ever said something even though you have proof. Number 3, they use what is near and dear to you as ammunition. Number 4, they wear you down over time. Number 5, their actions do not match their words. Number 6, they throw in positive reinforcement to confuse you. Number 7, they know confusion weakens people. Number 8, they project. Number 9, they try to align people against you. Number 10, they tell you or others that you are crazy. And number 11, they tell you that everyone else is a liar. Now, one might spend a long time on any one of these, but the most prevalent form of gaslighting that I have seen in the media over the past few years has been the way in which they will persistently present an extreme, fringe and radical view held by a tiny minority of people as being in some way representative of what the vast majority of people think, and by the same token presenting views that are genuinely representative of the majority of people as being at the extreme fringes of allowable opinion. This is a persistent technique on our very own BBC, and it can be seen across a range of issues, from Brexit to how seriously we should take the views of a 16-year-old from Sweden on climate change. There are several studies which have shown evidence of this. In The Strange Death of Europe, Douglas Murray showed the wide gap between audiences whooping and cheering for mass immigration on question time when opinion polls show that the majority of people consistently oppose it. Using data from the British Social Attitude Survey, David Goodhart suggests that this tendency has gone on for many years. Peter Hitchens recounts an episode from 1967 in which the Rolling Stones were charged for various drug offences and Keith Richards was imprisoned for a year. A poll at the time showed that 56% of the population aged between 21 and 34 thought that the sentence was not harsh enough, while only 12% thought that it was too harsh. Yet it was the view of the 12% that was amplified by the media and indeed the eternally right-on Tory party as normative. It could not be clearer then that, wittingly or otherwise, the intellectuals use state institutions, the media, schools, universities, as vehicles for ideological indoctrination in much the manner described by the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, a thinker that virtually all university graduates who later make up the ranks of the intellectuals are expected to read. This also explains the persistent belief among the non-ruling elite that voters must have been tricked or brainwashed somehow into supporting Brexit or Donald Trump. It cannot possibly be that their own ideas are being vocalized by someone with a platform, or that those voters simply agree with what they are hearing. They must be explained away as victims of propaganda, and naturally this is pure projection on their part, because that is precisely what they need to do in order to gain support. Finally, when all else fails, the enemies of liberty must resort to the Kafka trap. This is a preemptive verbal strike at their opponent, designed, as ever, to avoid discussing the issues at hand. The Kafka trap involves a serious smear of some kind, usually accompanied by a label and an accusation: racist, sexist, homophobic, far right, and so on. Structurally, it is identical to the accusation faced by John Proctor in The Crucible. He is accused of consorting with the devil by Judge Danforth, who is essentially a witch-finder general. It is a trap because no direct answer to the accusation will do. If you deny it, it is affirmation that you did indeed consort with the devil and must be burned at the stake accordingly. In fact, The more you deny it, the further you appear to be guilty. If you affirm it, let us say with a confession and an apology, then you did indeed consort with the devil and must be burned at the stake accordingly. There is no way out of this if you give the accuser moral authority. The technique is used to move the argument from the arena of logos, that is reason and logic, where intellectuals are, despite their reputation, usually very weak, to ethos, that is the moral character of the opponent. Many writers from the past, such as Shakespeare, for example, would have instantly recognized these moves. That is because they were trained in rhetoric as part of their education. They could tell logos, ethos, and pathos apart. However, as far as I can see, our state education system, despite repeated claims to teach critical thinking, does not teach logic or argumentation at any point. I suppose that is progress for you. And so people are just as susceptible to it as are the crowds who are swayed by Mark Antony's rhetoric in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So how must we counter this form of linguistic terrorism? As we have seen repeatedly in recent years, the enemies of liberty pull no punches. They think nothing of destroying lives. There is no limit to how low they will stoop in pursuit of their own careers, which they have the temerity to dress up as an anointed vision. The ends justify any and every means. Therefore, their opponents, who represent the biggest threat to their continued hegemony, must be ritually purged from polite society. There is no way to counter the Kafka trap if you submit to the moral authority of the accusers. The only form of defense here is to deny them moral authority and to go on the attack until we can argue from a position of moral strength, confident, unapologetic, and uncowed. The prospects for liberty in the next decade seem as faint as a flicker of a solitary candle. Now get out. One of the striking things about recent politics is how the middle class seem to have become thoroughly left-wing. It was notable that as they lost their heartlands in the north of England in the general election, the Labour Party's only gain was in Putney, an area in which the median wage is £70,000. I have long had a theory that what we are seeing is not a political phenomena, but a religious one, and that this strata of the middle class, who cleave to social justice, are a modern manifestation of what one might call the Puritan spirit.
Because I'm literally a communist.
One can see it, for example, in William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, in which two knights, Sir Toby and Sir Andrew, are united with two members of the lower orders, Feste the clown and Maria the servant, who serves in the court of Olivia, who is a noblewoman, against one of the middling sort, Malvolio, who is described in the play as a kind of Puritan. The play is set during the festive period of Christmas. Let's watch a little bit.
Come begin. Hold thy peace, thou knave knight. Hold thy peace, thou knave knight. Hold thy peace, thou knave knight. Hold thy peace, thou knave knight.
What a caterwauling do you keep here? If my lady have not called up her steward Malvolio and bid him turn you out of doors, never trust me.
My lady's a Catan. We are politicians. Malvolio's a peg or rams. And 3 million, and 3 million, and 3 million, and 3. Am I not consanguineous? Am not I of her blood, Tilly Belly? Lady, that dwelt a merry Babylon. Lady.
Oh, beshrew me, the knight's in admirable fooling.
Aye, he does well enough if he be disposed, but so do I too. He does it with a better grace, but I do it more naturally.
Oh, 12th of December.
My true love said to me, fine gold ring, fine gold.
Love of God, peace.
My masters, are you mad? Or what are you? Have you no wit, manners, nor honesty, but to gabble like tinkers at this time of night? Do you make an ale house of my lady's house, that you squeak out your coziest catches without any mitigation or remorse of voice? Is there no respect of place, persons, nor time in you?
We did keep time, sir, in our catches. Neck up.
Toby, I must be round with you. My lady bade me tell you that though she harbours you as her kinsman, she's nothing allied to your disorders. If you can separate yourself and your misdemeanors, you are welcome to the house. If not, and it would please you to take leave of her, she's very willing to bid you farewell.
Farewell, dear heart, since I must needs be gone.
Good Sir Toby.
His eyes do show his days are almost done.
Is it even so?
But I will never die.
Sir Toby, there you lie.
This is much credit to him.
I bid him go and spare not.
No! No, no, you dare not.
Haven't you, sir, you lie. Art any more than a steward? Dost thou think because thou art virtuous there shall be no more cakes and ale?
Yes, by St. Anne. And ginger shall be hot in the mouth, too.
Right.
Now, this general attitude and spirit did not go away in the 1950s. Indeed, it fueled the English Civil War, and there was always a streak of it in the middle strata, right through the Victorian period as well. One can see it in the figure of Jeremy Corbyn himself, especially in the footage here. He seems a prig and, well, a kind of Puritan, especially when contrasted with the Falstaffian and Sir Toby-like figure of Boris Johnson. One of the films that captures the essence of this sort of puritanical middle class, and a personal favourite of mine, is Mike Leigh's Nuts in May. Let me play you a little clip in which Keith Pratt and his wife, Candice Marie, have invited the hapless PE student Ray over to their tent, ostensibly to take a photograph for them. But it ends up becoming more like a lecture. Take a look.
Really, you know?
Oh, I saw you doing your exercises this morning. I follow the Royal Canadian Air Force system myself.
Oh, yeah?
You have a system?
Well, I was just doing basic sort of rugby circuit training, really, you know?
Yes, but is it a system?
What do you mean, system?
Well, is it tabulated? Do you time yourself?
Well, you can do if you want to, you know, but I was just loosening up.
Oh, I see. You see my maximum minimum thermometer over there?
Oh, yeah?
One of my instruments for logging the weather. Another one over here. This is a portable barometer. A bit like a travelling clock, really. Bit silly in the middle of the night if you wake up, want to know the time. Turn over and all you'll find out is whether it's fair or foul.
Take sugar, eh?
Yeah, 2, please.
It's only brown sugar, is that all right?
Sure, as long as it's sweet, you know.
We don't keep the killer whites in our tent, do we, Candice Marie?
No.
Flour, white sugar. A lot of people don't realise the body doesn't need sugar as most people know it. It breaks down carbohydrates into polysaccharides, which are natural sugars more easily absorbed by the body.
We can get our sugar from fruit and honey.
Glucose, sucrose and frucrose. Did you know that, Ray?
Yeah.
Oh. Do you, eat meat, Ray?
Oh, yeah, I love meat. It's great.
Candice Marie and I don't take it, do we?
No. Keith and I believe that it's inhumane to kill animals for food.
Man is not a carnivore. He's naturally a frugivore. He eats fruit and nuts.
It's interesting to note, Ray, that a carnivore's jaws move up and down like this, but a plant-eating animal and human beings' jaws also swing from side to side like that.
Yes, and a carnivore has a very short intestine, suitable for carrying the putrefying meat through the system, whereas a human being has a very long intestine, not suitable for that function at all. No wonder so many people have cancer of the bowel.
Well, I don't know, a lot of athletes and sportsmen eat meat. They seem to do all right by it.
Oh, yes, but it's a well-known fact, Ray, that a world champion marathon runner was a vegetarian, and he reckoned that it improved his running.
Yes, a lot of famous people in history have been vegetarians. Leonardo da Vinci, Malcolm Muggeridge. And God said, Behold, I have given unto thee every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of every tree-yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29.
Do you mind if I smoke?
Well,
You do what you want to do, Ray.
it's just that Keith and I believe that smoking damages your health.
Well, never mind.
You see, Ray, you can't see the damage that it's doing. But if I could take one of your lungs now and put it on the table in front of you and cut it in half, I think you'd be absolutely horrified.
You have to remember that the air polluted by one person has to be breathed by everybody else. Pollution is one of the great disasters of our age.
I see running a car doesn't bother you much.
Oh, I only use it for getting from A to B.
As Nuts in May progresses, we see more and more of the brittleness of Keith and Candice Marie's worldview. Things come to a head when a pair of working-class brummies, that's people from Birmingham, for you American viewers, illegally start a fire on the campsite. Watch what happens.
You're being very silly, you know. Because if you do light an open fire, then you're going to get thrown off the campsite.
Now, don't be silly.
No, will you mind your own bleeding business?
It is my business. My business is to protect the life of the countryside and our heritage. Now, you don't seem to be aware of those things, so I'm advising you as to the extent of your responsibilities. You shouldn't be breaking those branches, and you shouldn't be making a fire.
Gotcha, monk.
Now, I don't want to get you into trouble, but if you go on with this, I shall have to go and tell Miss Beale.
You can tell her you're bleeding well like.
All right, if that's the way you want it. And Miss Beale doesn't seem to be around, and so I'm assuming responsibility.
But you didn't look for her, did you?
Yes, I did, and she's not there. Now, stop what you're doing.
No. What the bleeding hell do you think you were?
I'm a good citizen who's aware of his responsibilities.
You're a bloody comedian, mate.
No, I'm not. Now, stop what you're doing.
No. Look, I paid my money. You got no right to come telling me what to do.
Oh, I've got every right. I have the power to arrest you if I wanted to. Now, stop making that fire.
You copper?
No, but every citizen has the right to arrest another citizen who's breaking the law. Now, be told.
What law am I breaking?
You're breaking the laws of the campsite and the laws of the country code. Now, I don't want to have to use force.
You are?
Put the stick down.
No?
Oh, come on.
What are you going to do about it, didn't I?
Just put the stick down.
Just leave it.
You want to fight? I'm going to...
Look, be told!
You touch me, I'm going to bleeding kill you.
Now, look, I don't want to fight you. I just want to tell you that you shouldn't... Look, keep away from me! I just want you to stop making the fire and stop breaking those branches.
Come on, Finger, leave it alone.
Come on, hit me. Come on.
No, I'm not going to. Get away from me! I'll knock your head off! Get back! I'm warning you! Knock your head off! I'll knock your head off! You come on then if you want to fight! Come on in if you want to fight!
I'll give you a bleeding fight!
Come on! Come on! Let's fight! Come on! I'll knock your head off!
Touch me, mate!
Oh, Finger, just slip! Oh, put it down!
Come on then! Come on! What about it, eh? I'll knock your head off! Come on then!
Look, you get your geezer over here so I'll kick this bloody table over. Keith! Keith, she's got a knife and she's going to kick the table over!
Put the stick down, you bastard! I'll fucking kill you!
Keith!
Come on then! Come on!
Finger!
Your head off! Get away from there! Get back! You get back!
Finger! Finger, get over here!
Hey, bloody about Saturday!
Oh, shut up!
Hey, bastard! Bloody well crying now!
Oh, shut up!
Bloody well crying!
Oh!
So, how can we account for all of this? Why are the middle class so puritanical? I recently saw two excellent takes on this. The first is from the distinguished historian, Dr. David Starkey.
Well, you see, I think the way in many ways to understand the liberal establishment, it's why also, again, it's very interesting to look at the parallels in British politics and American politics. Everybody's pointing out the similarities between the vote for Trump. I was at the inauguration, and the hilarious Women's March the day after, where all of these respectable ladies went round wearing knitted vaginas on their head. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. The parallelism between British politics and American politics, I think it's rooted in the fact that both of our countries had a fundamentalist form of religion called Puritanism. And the modern liberal is the direct descendant of the old nonconformist or Puritan. I was inoculated against this. I was describing a little bit about where I grew up. I was inoculated against this growing up in Kendal. My parents, although they were working class, were members of one of these extraordinary religious sects. They were Quaker. And Quakerism is a direct descendant of the Puritanism of the 17th century, and it's the meetings are still completely unstructured. The meetings for worship are completely unstructured, and you're supposed to get up and speak as the Spirit moves you. And even as an 11-year-old boy, I can remember sitting there in this very beautiful stripped room with the enormous round-headed Georgian windows and the pattern of light creeping over the floor, listening to these people and thinking, isn't it extraordinary that God reads the Manchester Guardian? And that's what it is. And that self-righteous contempt for ordinary people, that sense that you don't argue with them, you simply tell them what is right, because you know better. This sense again that you know, the Corbynistas, the momentum, there's these eyes of staring fanatics. You look at somebody like Owen Jones or Ash, whatever she's called, they're fanatics. They would burn you in a second. They believe in heresy. They believe that, you know, if you actually disagree with what they say, it's not simply a matter of intellectual disagreement. You are fundamentally wicked. And they would put you in a gulag in a second. This is the authentic Puritan approach. This is, you know, why you have the witch trials in Salem, and is why this phenomenon of woke, this phenomenon of PC, social justice, is really almost peculiar to the Anglo-Saxon world. You don't find anything like it in continental Europe. There's nothing that resembles it at all. And do you know what? What we've had, therefore, is just like a rerun of the Civil War. You have the Puritan victory, you have the regime of the major generals, you have abolishing Christmas, and then you know what? There comes along a restoration, and it's wonderful. What do we do to the Puritan leaders? We chop their ghoulies off, pull their guts out, chop them in 4, and string up the remains, you know. And that, in a politer way, is what's just happened.
Now let's hear a second take from Dr. Edward Dutton, also known as the Jolly Heretic.
It defines class. What makes you middle class as opposed to working class or upper class? And this was very interesting. And you see it a great deal in the 19th century, and this is very much when the middle classness, people start to self-identify as middle class. They realise, I'm not upper class. The upper class don't need to work. The upper class are gentlemen, whatever. I have to work. In that sense, I'm a worker, but I'm not working class. I'm different from these working class people. How am I different? And how are they different is a number of things that define middle classness. One of them is education, and there is a tendency for the middle class to stress education, to say they have different values from the working class or the upper class, both of whom value money. The upper class will value money plus ancestry. The working class will value money plus kind of toughness and that sort of thing, sport, whatever. But the middle class, it's a value for education as a good in itself, and this becomes a value of the Victorian middle class. Another is morality. They'll say, oh well, you know, we're not like either the working class or the upper class because they're immoral. They're not religious. They're ungodly, and we're in that sense superior to them. And so, how can we stress our middle classness? How can we make it clear to everyone we're middle class? Well, the answer is these moral panics that you get against alcohol in the 19th century, that you get against pornography and sexual issues and whatever. And you could perhaps even trace that back to the 16th or 17th century and look at the Puritans, and what a lot of the Puritans were middle class people. A lot of them were merchants and craftsmen and people like this who were engaging with Protestantism really in a kind of moral panic. And it was the upper class that were Catholic. Protestantism came from the middle class. It was pushed by the middle class, and it can be argued as an attempt to gain moral status and say, okay, yeah, we're not upper class, fine, but we're not as high as you, but we're more moral than you. We're superior to you in that way. We're more moral than you. We're more religious than you. We're more intellectual than you. So this goes back all out as for the working class. Well, you know, again, we're more moral than you. You have illegitimate children and fornication and whatever. We're not demonstrating the influence of middle class values as farming, which was associated with the landowners' contracts, and these people from middle class backgrounds who are the industrialists and the lawyers and whatever and the bureaucrats take over society, and their Puritan values begin to take over society, and so you have these moral panics. And you could argue that the moral panics of today against climate rebellion and against racism and all of this stuff that you would associate in England with the New Labour particularly, can be regarded as the descendants of these earlier Victorian moral panics, which are in turn the descendants of these Puritan Protestant moral panics. A lot of people have commented on the Puritanism of the Extinction Rebellion. It's a way of asserting social class status, of saying I am superior to the working class because the working class is Brexit, chav, scum, and I'm superior to the upper class because the upper class, although they are upper class, they are these old Etonian yuck, you know, the immoral people. They have no social conscience. They have no morality, and so that is the essence of the social class system in England.
And this, it seems to me, hits the nail on the head. The middling sort have had to get ahead through some combination of their education and moral rectitude, and so have a permanent incentive to be seen to know more and to be more virtuous than thou. And that is why the middle class is so left-wing. Now, have a Merry Christmas and get out. The phrase unconscious bias is bandied around with reckless abandon these days, which shows just how far the ideas of Sigmund Freud have penetrated into the fabric of society at large. But what is interesting to me is how these ideas first infiltrated and subverted Marxism. Now, as anyone who is a long-time watcher of this channel will know, I am no fan of Karl Marx, not least because his economics were in error. But say what you want about Marx, his basic lens was nonetheless economic, and, at least from the way a late 19th century Marxist would see it, grounded in material reality, to the extent that, in a conflict of visions, Thomas Sowell could not in good faith categorize Marx with the unconstrained visionaries and utopians. Clearly, Marx did not have the fully constrained or tragic vision of life, but his basic worldview was still realist in many ways. Therefore, Sowell says, Marx was a hybrid between the unconstrained and constrained visions. Now, if you were to ask me where the realism is in Marxism, it is not in its economics, which is mostly based on nonsense debunked theories such as David Ricardo's Iron Law of Wages and Thomas Malthus's theory of rent, but rather in its Machiavellian view of power. However, Marxism itself was subverted over time by Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud famously compared the human mind to an iceberg. Above the surface is the conscious mind, which you can see and are aware of, but under the surface there is the conscious mind, a swirling mass of animal instincts, unacceptable sexual desires, fears, violent motives, selfish needs, shameful experiences, buried memories, immoral urges, and so on. These are repressed by the conscious mind and pushed deep down, out of sight, but not quite out of mind, as it were. Now here, I am not going to say if this theory is true or untrue, scientifically proven, or simply conjecture, because it is not my place. What is more important for our purposes is understanding the impact of the belief in the unconscious mind and how that affected the way that people thought about the world, and more specifically how it came to subvert Marxism. Now, one of the first consequences of this belief in the unconscious mind is the destabilization of language and meaning. If underneath the conscious mind there is the swirling mass of unconscious desire, then it stands to reason that even if a writer did not consciously intend for it to do so, it will nonetheless bubble up to the surface through the cracks and the fissures. And so the task of the reader is no longer simply to read the words on the page, that is, to look at what is said, but rather to look beyond the page, to look at what is not said, to read between the lines, so to speak, to read the gaps, the subtext, the meaning that operates at an unconscious level. In other words, the reader must now focus on what is not there as a kind of amateur psychoanalyst and interpret for themselves what is really being said, even if the author had no idea of it themselves. So, in a sense, the power of generating meaning shifts from author to reader, metaphorically from the person on the couch to the quote-unquote expert analysing them. And this is what happened in Marxism. This man is Louis Althusser, and he's a very interesting thinker in his own right, who, in many respects, came up with the concept that we today call the cathedral. Only he was analysing things from the left and not the right. The only problem was that Althusser was an orthodox Marxist, and, well, Karl Marx didn't really discuss the cathedral or anything like it. But it was the done thing at the time for Marxist theorists to find ways to attribute their own ideas to the great man himself, almost like theologians trying to justify their own new ideas using the Bible. So what Althusser did was to co-opt some ideas from the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, this chap pictured here, who was chiefly responsible for a Freudian invasion, or we might say subversion, of the field of linguistics. Then Althusser proceeded to claim that his own ideas about ideology and state power were what Marx really meant, if you read between the lines. Years later, Althusser even admitted that he'd never read most of Marx's works anyway. But what does it matter? Later Marxists simply claimed that they didn't really believe Althusser when he said that. And later Marxists still, such as Slavoj Žižek here, has openly said that he does not read the books on which he comments. And in this way, what Marx actually said no longer really mattered on the left. In fact, what did it matter? What anyone said? We can always go back and claim what they really meant using our tools of reading between the lines. To demonstrate how this might work in practice, let us take a fairly innocuous nursery rhyme, The Wheels on the Bus.
The wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round. The wheels on the bus go round and round all day long.
Now, to the untrained eye, these are just some lines about a bus making its daily stops. But to the expert eye, trained in the ways of Marxism, we can plainly see that it is talking about the wheels of capitalism, which go round and round, revealing the monotony of everyday life and the alienation that every worker feels. And the bus travelling all day long reveals that the bus driver is, of course, being exploited. And this, Althusser would say, is the scientific knowledge, reality as it really is, so to speak. And let's continue.
The mummies on the bus go chat, 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 chat. The mummies on the bus go chat, chat, chat all day long.
Now immediately we can see the mommies are poor, downtrodden and oppressed because they are forced to use public transport, unlike rich, privileged people who drive around in their fancy cars. In fact, the bus itself reveals themes of racial justice because it recalls images of Rosa Parks at the back of the bus. The bus is a site of political struggle with a deep history. However, the song underlines the ugliness of our patriarchal society. The ideas that the mommies would be chatting all day long is a hateful stereotype on which this nursery rhyme is playing, whether consciously or not. Perhaps this is a dangerous song to play to young children because it is filling their unconscious minds with the idea that women chat on buses. Now, we could do this all day long, but you get the picture. Once this basic move of shifting from text to subtext is made, the scope of intellectual fraudulence is tremendously increased. And even though this seems like a harmless thing, it is partly what has led us directly to the dire straits in which we now find ourselves in 2020, and especially in which we find our universities. What we are looking at here is the total subversion of logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Only the capital W here is a good example of white Western imperialism, and the capital G of God clearly aligns him with that white Western imperialism. And these two facts combined reveal that Christianity is a total tool of white oppression and capitalism. Therefore, we must bring it down. But this tendency on the left, while obviously pernicious, does cause a deep epistemological problem for us. How do you combat this sort of thing? On what basis is this sort of thing wrong? What claims would you need to make to disprove any of the reasons I've given in this video? How can you justify those claims? And this is my challenge to you. In fact, if you have any really deep thoughts on this, perhaps even email me an essay and send it through to naturalrightsjournal@gmail.com. If I get a few great ones, I might even revive the idea of putting a journal together. Personally, I think this tendency, the language game, the shifting sands of meaning, the impetus to read subtext rather than text, is a much bigger problem than anybody gives it credit for, and a much bigger enemy for us to face than anyone realizes. Be sure to like this video and subscribe, and if you really like my content, maybe consider joining the channel or donating, or maybe even buy a mug. I am grateful for all of your support. Now get out. The scenes you have been watching are from Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. Notice how they consist of everyday people going about their everyday lives. How many of them do you think believed they were living in a totalitarian hellhole? If you stopped and asked them, how many would realise it, let alone tell you? It's common of Western writers to assume that these poor people were simply brainwashed, that the likes of Stalin or Hitler did not enjoy the tacit consent of the governed because they were popular, but rather because the populations of the USSR and Nazi Germany were terrorized at gunpoint and knew that dissent would get them shot. Is that really true? Or is it what Western liberals tell themselves? Do you believe that either Hitler or Stalin were widely disliked in the countries over which they ruled? Or do you believe that they were quite the opposite, genuinely popular with most people, as any ruler must be in order to govern? I'll leave that for you to answer, but while you're thinking about it, I want you to consider another question. Did the average Russian in 1929 or the average German in 1935 seriously think about the liberal USA or the liberal United Kingdom as bastions of freedom as compared with the totalitarian hellholes in which they were living themselves? Well, I ask you, if they did believe that, why is it that 4.4 million German men fought for the Axis powers rather than defecting to the British or the Americans? Were they simply brainwashed? How about the millions of Russians who gave their lives in various wars? Just brainwashed? Why do we imagine that the people who gave their lives for these regimes were brainwashed, but that our own war casualties were the results of men bravely fighting because of their own values? In 2020, it has become a cliche to quote George Orwell's 1984 endlessly about the societies in which we find ourselves. We watch history get rewritten, we watch truth being fabricated, we watch thoughts being policed, we see language being controlled and altered, we see books being censored, we see enemies of the party depersoned, imprisoned and tortured for speaking the truth. But I ask you, why do you imagine it was ever any different? Dissidents have always been persecuted, and the system has presented you with many different Emmanuel Goldstein figures over the years to give you your allowance of 2 minutes hate. The flow of information has always been maintained by a hegemonic ministry of truth. The only difference between now and then is that the internet, a technology that appears to have caught the authorities on the hop, has made it much more difficult to carry on as they used to. We are watching our own nations now become more openly authoritarian only because they have lost the control of the information flow. The standard reading of George Orwell's 1984 has been to see it as some sort of commentary on the totalitarian regimes the world was witnessing back in 1948. Or some say it was a warning for the future. But what if Orwell was trying to tell us, in his idea of the three great powers, Oceania, Eurasia and East Asia, who are permanently in some state of war, that even back in 1948, British or American people were already living in some form of totalitarian state? Certainly there are many things you might point to in the administrations of Clement Attlee or Franklin D. Roosevelt that were unmistakably totalitarian. If there was a 1948 Julian Assange, how would we really know about it? Certainly immense propaganda efforts were made during the Second World War and in its direct aftermath. Does anyone, even for a second, believe that the Nuremberg trials were free or fair? Were the Nuremberg trials more humane than Stalin's show trials, or whatever passed for justice in the Third Reich? These are questions, again, I only ask you to ponder. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied, sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. And besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred, more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia. Since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everyone, although every day and 1,000 times a day, on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers, in books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all of this, his influence never seemed to grow less Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In no public or private utterance was it ever admitted that the three powers had at any time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia. But that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Therefore, Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible.
If you like Academic Agent's content on this channel, sign up for a course on the Academic Agency. He's now offering Foundations of Economics. Click the link in the show description and level up your econ knowledge.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe, and if you really like my content, maybe consider joining the channel or donating, or maybe even buy a mug. I am grateful for all of your support. Now get out.
Buy Foundations of Writing on the Academic Agency. To write clearly will help you to think clearly. The ability to communicate ideas in lucid prose is foundational to success in many areas, and it is a basic requirement in every walk of life. You will learn the parts of speech and come to understand the core functions of the English language, sentence construction and syntax, punctuation, style, and common mistakes. Once you see how mistakes are made, you will not unsee them. You will know for the rest of your life. Foundations of Writing. Buy it now.
In recent times, I've been studying the rhetorical tactics of self-avowed centrists who are, in actual fact, liberals. Not leftists, which is to say socialists, but liberals. As the author of both Foundations of Logic and Foundations of Rhetoric, which you can buy right now on the Academic Agency, I have a special interest in how people avoid either making arguments or engaging with them. Many times what you find is emotionalism concealed by certain tactics that are designed to protect the interlocutor from actually confronting the point in front of them. Now, while everyone does this, people on the left, people on the right, and people in the centre, it seems most marked to me when you have people in the centre arguing or attempting to argue with someone from their right. This is partly because centrists will have spent most of their time dealing with arguments from the left, and so simply do not see where the rightists will be coming from, but it is also because the rightists will likely be hitting them with truths that produce cognitive dissonance in them, cause them to panic, cause them to reach, and so on, simply because they have no comebacks. So let us see what these rhetorical tricks are. So the first one is tactical ignorance, aka playing the hatchling. Now I have to credit this one to Morgoth's review, but it is where the centrist acts like they know nothing at all, like they've literally just been hatched into the world, and so ask questions and yet more questions about things that everybody knows. I came across this in the debate over gender roles. What's a traditional man? What's a traditional woman? As if everyone and their uncle and his dog doesn't know. The aim of this tactic is not because they want answers. It's not honest engagement. What they're trying to do is to wear you down, or else find some minute point on which they can focus and then quibble. You have to call out this nonsense straight away, rather than answering their questions. Deny it from the very off. Second tactic is tactical libertarianism. This galling tactic is when a centrist professes that the only real objection they have to something is the use of state force, as if they were a libertarian. This was a tactic employed by certain people recently when we debated the traditional gender roles. The line was, yes, we agree with traditional gender roles, we just object to the state enforcing it. Now, there is a surefire way to tell if someone is a genuine libertarian, and that is to bring up freedom of association, and in particular the forced desegregation of the 1960s, when the Federal Army was used to march kids to school at gunpoint. If they support these things, as it turned out that these particular people I'm talking about did, then they do not actually care a jot if the state is used to enforce morality, if it is a moral they share. It's perfectly possible that the person will be a true libertarian, of course, but in that case, they wouldn't be a centrist. Libertarians tend to be consistent and logical, if nothing else. The third tactic is what I'd call tactical nihilism. This is when the centrist momentarily accepts the premise of your argument, but then says, more or less, that's fine, I'll just go down with the ship, I don't care anyway. In other words, they tactically go Joker. I saw this happen frequently in the recent debates, with people deciding they were going to just try to be as degenerate as possible, to revel in the squalor a little bit, despite claiming earlier that they would actually prefer it if there were better moral and social norms in society. Variations of this include claiming not to be serious. It's just a comedy show, bro. Attacking you for being serious. Just get over yourself. Why are you so serious? Why do you care about this so much? Get over yourself. And similar. Any argument where one side is professing not to be serious is not an argument. However, these people typically alternate this tactical stance of not being serious with actually arguing. And so it is simply an irritation, a distraction. If someone you're arguing with does this to you, point out that it is a waste of time to argue with someone who isn't serious. Number 4, tactical adoption of leftist moral framework. This is where the centrist suddenly becomes a full-blown social justice warrior and starts screaming racist or fascists at you like a shrieking bird, like a snivelling little worm. You should consider this a victory of sorts, since it reveals them for who they really are. You should observe this and unsubscribe immediately from any nominally anti-SJW channel that does it. Leftists should have absolutely no place on your poll list in 2021, especially not leftists who pretend to be centrists. I consider these people vermin and absolute enemies, unworthy of engagement. You should never engage with leftists under any circumstances. There is no excuse to watch people after you've seen them engage in this behaviour. They're the lowest of the low. 5th, tactical adoption of rightist moral framework. This is where the centrist tries their version of Alinsky tactics and tries to get you to live up to some right-wing principle, or else point out where you failed to live up to it in the past. This was done constantly in the recent debate, where people who had just moments earlier claimed not to care a jot about traditional masculinity, and moments before that were actually asking the hatchling questions about, well, what is traditional masculinity? I just don't know. I've just been born. Moments after that, they then tried to hold me to some notion of traditional masculinity that they had in mind. These were desperate, flailing and sad tactics from intellectually outmatched people scrambling to save face. Don't fall for it. It would always be a mistake to try to prove yourself to whatever challenge is laid down by such people. A variation on this is tactical Christianity, where the interlocutor tries to appeal to some Christian sense of forgiveness or whatever else. Now, though I am not a Christian, people often mistake me for one, and they try this on me. You should always call this out, especially if the person you're arguing with is from a notable rival group. Let's say a group notable for being enemies of Christians in history. Next, we have the incorrect attribution of fallacy cascade. This is where the person has some idea of some logical fallacies. Maybe they read it once, maybe they've heard other people say it, such as straw man, cherry picking, whatever else. And then they just assert that one of these has been done, regardless of whether or not it has. This is probably done by somebody with double-digit IQ, or who has smoked too much weed perhaps. But the basic tactic is to keep throwing out the claim that some fallacy has been committed and hoping that the audience will be too stupid to realise that it has not. This was done to me recently when I was accused of cherry picking. I rebutted the point in full, only for the person who said it later to laugh it off because, you know, it's just a comedy show or something. Like I said, double-digit IQ and probably too much weed. 7th, arbitrary framing purity spiral. This is where the interlocutor tries to set some bar or standard of expectation of their opponent, only then to move the goalpost at some later date to some new standard. Now, I often try to head this off right at the very start of a discussion by asking the person to name their standard of proof. You know, before we even start talking about this, what information would actually convince you of my position? This way, you can actually see if they are in good faith. Most of the time, they will not be. In a recent discussion, my moronic opponents set arbitrary standards for discourse a few times. First claiming they wanted a good faith discussion, then claiming that only live debates and not video responses will do, then saying that they were too tired for a live debate when I actually said I'd come on, then saying actually that they never wanted an exchange at all but only sought to make fun. They did this in front of thousands of people, expecting them not to notice. Well, they did notice, or most of them did. All but the lowest IQ or most blindly loyal supporters of theirs called them out for it. So my advice for this is, like I said, try to set the standard up front and agree to it early, and preferably before you enter an exchange at all. It's not always possible, but if it is, you should try to do this right at the start. It saved me a lot of time when I've been debating these sorts of people before. Often, when you insist on naming the standard up front, they just won't do it. So there it is. You saved yourself time and effort there. Number 8, denying or minimizing the scope of the problem. Now, another typical centrist tactic is to try to play down the extent of a problem that you are arguing about, trying to shrug it off, claim it isn't real, and so on. I've seen this countless times in every sort of debate. The easiest one to spot is on immigration, when they try to argue that immigration or demographic change isn't an issue. It's perfectly possible, though, through sheer force of facts, to get them to shift from this position in real time, and I've seen that many times as well. But look out for it. You need to be prepared for it and have an arsenal of facts to hammer them over the head with. Literally hammer them until they basically have no option but to accept that there is a problem. Make sure that these facts are sourced to somewhere that is credible and will be credible in their eyes, and then keep going until they submit. Now, this is something I've talked about before, but sources, you need to stay away from like anything ideological. Newspapers of any description, you need to try to get to the source of whatever newspapers quote. Memes won't do. Right-wing websites won't do. Something like the Daily Mail won't do. Best to take it directly from government sources. Get them to a point where they literally cannot try to weasel out by saying, oh, well, I don't accept that source. And, often I've actually seen them then, that when they've got nowhere else to go, they actually then start to question the validity of the data, in which case there's nothing you can do. But that's on them. Now, in my experience, you will almost always be able to do this with immigration and crime. Immigration, self-evident. Crime, self-evident. Stuff like the pandemic or the 2020 election, not so much. There are certain issues on which this will not be possible, the hammering of facts, either because it will result in a pointless stat-off. I mean, literally every COVID discussion I've ever seen is just people posting graphs at each other. I have literally never seen a fruitful exchange on that topic, which is one of the reasons I never engage in it. Sometimes the regime will have ensured that there are simply no credible sources for the topic. That'll be the 2020 election. I know there are a few articles here and there, but in my experience, they don't really sway anybody either. So there are certain topics that you won't be able to get anywhere with on that. Something like climate change, where the very data itself is an amalgamation of models and so on. There's just no point in bringing those sorts of things up. Anyway, in those cases, you'll be dealing with someone who is literally incapable of accepting something unless a source of officialdom tells them to believe it. So when you're dealing with that sort of person, and they do exist in large numbers, it is best to leave them to midwittery and to point out that they are a slave to power and a perfect minion of the current ruling class. There's no hope for somebody who is at that level. I mean, you're basically dealing with a voucher at that point. The best resource with which to destroy the self-looping accepted sources of midwittery that I've come across is Ryan Falk's Leaving the Cathedral, which I think he's giving away free. I picked up this PDF from one of his videos that I saw. But naturally, none of the midwits that you'll be dealing with are going to read that. You should read it and adjust your argumentation methods accordingly. At the very best, you can get them to see or to accept some of the things that Falk points out with the problems of the endless self-looping sources of midwits. 9. Admitting the problem but pivoting to say, that's a good thing. Now, sometimes you can batter down the denial, the first level cope if you want, and get them to retreat to their second level cope, which is to accept what you're saying, but then try to defend the problem that you're outlining. Immigration's a classic case where it's like, okay, or certain crime conversation that you have, they'll be like, okay, I accept that, but actually it's a good thing, and here's why. And now here they will be on weak and unfamiliar ground, and it's time for you to move in for the kill. In fact, in my experience, this sort of moment here is where you'll start seeing some of the other tactics I've already mentioned in this video. They don't really know what to do. They'll flop all over the place in a way that is embarrassing both to themselves, to you, and anybody watching. In recent debates, I saw 2 people in particular so thoroughly embarrass themselves that they should probably delete their accounts. So that brings me to the final tactic that I want to outline in this video, which is a variant on the last one. Admitting the problem, but pivoting to say the problem is you. So this is where, yes, they accept the problem, so you don't need to hammer them with any more facts or anything else. But then they try to somehow claim that the problem is you for having the problem with the problem. Now, in the case of immigration, this is where they start calling you a racist or whatever. In the case of the recent debate on gender roles, this is where they started psychologizing and claiming I was insecure. Now, you must step through this tactic by pointing out what they are doing and insisting that they address the point. Here, what they're doing is attacking the man and not the argument. They need to attack the argument and not the man. And naturally, clowns will never address the point and will instead do things like troll your social media for what they think are incriminating quotations. They'll call you names. They'll try to smear you with out-of-context quotations, Photoshop quotes, and so on. This is actually a victory. When people do this, they reveal who they really are. I think we've seen who some people really are recently. Don't support them. Don't give them money. Unsubscribe from them. Tell them where to go. They have absolutely no place in a community such as this, and I'd hope that nobody watching this would ever waste their time on such people ever again. Frankly, disgraceful conduct. It goes without saying, if they try such classic SJW tactics on you, never apologize, never address their claims, never dignify their fake outrage. Step over them. We'll never be sorry. Now get out.
Now available at the Academic Agency. Sharpen your analytical mind and your argumentation skills with Foundations of Logic. The course draws on the ancient wisdom of traditional logic that students learned for over 2,000 years, from the time of Aristotle through to the medieval schoolmen, right down to the 20th century. Sign up now for a free preview lecture.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe, and if you really like my content, maybe consider joining the channel or donating or maybe even buy a mug. I am grateful for all of your support. Now get out.